The geographical landscape of England during the early 12th century presented a complex mosaic of Norman lordships, Anglo-Saxon communities, and emerging ecclesiastical territories that would provide the political and economic foundation for the establishment of military religious institutions unprecedented in the island's history. The consolidation of Norman power following William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings in 1066 had transformed English society through the systematic redistribution of landed wealth, the construction of defensive fortifications throughout the kingdom, and the integration of English ecclesiastical structures with continental reform movements that emphasized papal authority and monastic discipline. The Norman aristocracy that controlled England by the second decade of the 12th century comprised warrior families, whose wealth derived primarily from agricultural estates, worked by English peasant populations, supplemented by urban properties in the developing commercial centres that were beginning to transform the economic landscape of post-conquest England. The relationship between these Norman lords and the Anglo-Saxon populations they governed remained complex and often contentious, with linguistic barriers, cultural differences, and memories of conquest, creating social divisions that would persist for generations. The ecclesiastical transformation of England during the decades following the Norman conquest had created institutional frameworks that would prove essential for the reception and development of new religious movements originating on the European continent, the appointment of continental clergy to English bishoprics and abbacies, the introduction of reformed monastic observances based on continental models, and the strengthening of connections between English ecclesiastical institutions and the papal curia in Rome had positioned the English Church as an integral component of Western Christendom's emerging institutional structures. The establishment of Benedictine monasteries throughout England, following the customs of reformed houses such as Cluny and Bec, had created networks of religious communities that maintained international connections while accumulating substantial landed wealth through donations from pious aristocrats seeking spiritual benefits and social prestige. These monastic institutions, by the early 12th century, controlled significant portions of England's agricultural land and played crucial roles in estate management, agricultural innovation, and the provision of various social services, including education, hospitalization, and poor relief. The First Crusade's successful capture of Jerusalem in 1099 had generated unprecedented enthusiasm for military pilgrimage throughout Western Europe, transforming religious attitudes toward violence and creating new conceptual frameworks that could reconcile Christian teachings about peace with the practical realities of warrior aristocratic culture. The establishment of the Crusader states in the Levant, comprising the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli, created permanent Christian settlements in territories that had been under Islamic control for over 4 centuries. These fragile political entities, surrounded by hostile Muslim powers and dependent on continuous reinforcement from Europe, required institutional innovations that could sustain military operations while maintaining the spiritual legitimacy essential for attracting ongoing support from Western Christians. The pilgrimage routes, connecting European departure points with the holy sites of Jerusalem and surrounding regions, presented significant dangers from bandits, harsh environmental conditions, and hostile military forces, creating practical needs for organized protection that traditional ecclesiastical or secular institutions were poorly equipped to provide. The foundation of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the order's formal title before common usage shortened it to Knights Templar, or simply Templars, emerged from this complex intersection of religious devotion, military necessity, and institutional innovation in the newly established Crusader states. The traditional account of the order's foundation, preserved in various chronicle sources from the 12th century, attributes its creation to Hugues de Payens, a knight from the Champagne region of France, and a small group of companions who pledged themselves around 1119 to protecting Christian pilgrims, travelling between the port of Jaffa and Jerusalem. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, recognizing both the pious intentions and practical utility of this initiative, reportedly granted the Knights quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, a location that gave the order its distinctive name and powerful symbolic associations with Solomon's Temple from Jewish and Christian sacred history. The precise circumstances of the order's early years remain somewhat obscure due to limited contemporary documentation, though the basic narrative of a small group of religiously motivated knights developing into an international military religious order is supported by various independent sources. The transformation of this small band of knights into a formally recognized religious order required ecclesiastical approval and the development of an institutional rule that could define the order's religious character, organizational structure, and operational procedures. Hughes de Payen's journey to Europe in 1128, undertaken to seek recognition and support for his nascent organization, coincided with important ecclesiastical councils and provided opportunities for presenting the order's mission to influential church leaders and secular aristocrats. The Council of Troyes, convened in January 1129 under the auspices of Pope Honorius II, provided the crucial ecclesiastical recognition that transformed the Templars from an informal association of pious knights into a formal religious order with approved rules and regulations. The council's participants included numerous bishops, abbots, and other ecclesiastical dignitaries, along with secular nobles from various regions of France, creating an assembly with sufficient authority to grant legitimate recognition to new religious foundations. The development of the Templar rule, traditionally attributed to Bernard of Clairvaux, though likely involving contributions from various ecclesiastical authorities and the knights themselves, established the constitutional framework that would govern the order throughout its existence. Bernard, the influential Cistercian abbot, whose theological writings and political activities made him one of the most powerful figures in 12th century Western Christendom, had family connections to Hughes de Payens and personal interest in promoting crusading activities. His involvement in formulating the Templar rule provided the order with prestigious endorsement and ensured that its regulations conformed to contemporary standards for reformed monastic observance. The rule itself, existing in both Latin and French versions, and surviving in numerous medieval manuscripts, combined traditional monastic requirements regarding poverty, chastity, and obedience with specific provisions addressing the military activities and practical needs of knights operating in hostile territories. The detailed regulations governing daily religious observances, dietary requirements, clothing standards, and disciplinary procedures created comprehensive systems for organizing communal life while maintaining appropriate religious character. The military provisions of the Templar rule reflected practical experience with warfare in the Crusader states and established standards for equipment, tactical procedures, and command structures that would characterize the order's military operations. The regulations specified required equipment for knight brothers, including multiple horses, various weapons and armor pieces, and support personnel necessary for maintaining combat effectiveness. The tactical provisions emphasized discipline and coordinated action rather than individual heroics, prohibiting knights from breaking formation or engaging enemies without authorization from their commanders. These military regulations, while never providing detailed tactical manuals, established principles that shaped the Templars' reputation as exceptionally disciplined and effective military forces. The integration of monastic religious discipline with military organization created hybrid institutions that contemporaries found both impressive and somewhat anomalous, as the combination of monks and warriors challenged traditional categories that had previously separated religious contemplation from martial violence. Bernard of Clairvaux's theological treatise, In Praise of the New Knighthood, composed around 1130 to promote the Templar order, provided sophisticated intellectual justification for combining religious vows with military service. The treatise addressed potential objections that military activities were incompatible with Christian religious life, by developing arguments that distinguished legitimate violence in defense of Christianity from sinful violence motivated by greed or worldly ambition. Bernard's rhetorical strategies included contrasting the worldly knights of secular society, motivated by vainglory and material gain, with the new spiritual knights of the temple, who fought for Christ's cause with pure intentions and appropriate humility. The treatise's descriptions of the holy sites in Jerusalem and surrounding regions, which the Templars were pledged to defend, provided vivid imagery that connected the order's military mission with salvation, history, and biblical narratives familiar to medieval Christian audiences. The intellectual framework Bernard provided proved influential in shaping European attitudes toward crusading and military religious orders, though his idealized portrait of Templar spirituality represented aspirations rather than necessarily describing actual behavior of all order members. The expansion of Templar operations during the 1130s and 1140s, both in the Crusader states and throughout Western Europe, demonstrated the order's success in attracting support from diverse constituencies, including kings, nobles, ecclesiastical institutions, and urban communities. The strategic value of maintaining permanent military forces in the Crusader states became increasingly apparent as Muslim powers, particularly under the leadership of Zengi, and later his son Nur ad-Din, launched coordinated campaigns to reconquer territories lost during the First Crusade. The Templars' willingness to garrison isolated fortresses, conduct reconnaissance operations, and maintain continuous military readiness provided capabilities that Crusader states' secular rulers, dependent on feudal levies of limited duration, could not reliably sustain. The order's reputation for military effectiveness, combined with its religious character and international structure, made it attractive to donors throughout Europe who wished to support the defense of the Holy Land while gaining spiritual benefits associated with supporting a recognized religious order. The establishment of Templar houses throughout Western Europe during this formative period created the logistical infrastructure necessary for sustaining the order's military operations in the Crusader states, while providing institutional frameworks for managing the growing volume of donations and properties. The pattern of expansion followed routes connecting major pilgrimage centers and commercial thoroughfares, with Templar establishments positioned to facilitate the movement of personnel, money, and supplies between European bases and Eastern operational theaters. The properties donated to the order included agricultural estates, urban buildings, churches, mills, and various other income-generating assets that collectively provided the economic foundation for supporting military operations. The management of these diverse properties required administrative capabilities, extending beyond the purely military expertise of knight brothers, necessitating the recruitment of sergeant brothers and various non-combatant members who could handle agricultural production, financial accounting, and other essential support functions. The Templars' arrival in England must be understood within this broader context of international expansion and the specific political circumstances prevailing in the Anglo-Norman realm during the late 1120s and early 1130s. King Henry I, who had ruled England since 1100 and controlled substantial territories in Normandy through inheritance and conquest, represented the kind of powerful monarch whose support could significantly advance the order's interests. Henry's reputation for administrative capability and his success in maintaining relatively stable governance, despite challenges from various quarters, made England an attractive destination for an order seeking to establish reliable revenue sources. The king's religious patronage, while conventional for monarchs of his era, included support for various monastic foundations and crusading initiatives that suggested potential receptivity to the Templars' mission. The practical advantages of gaining English support included access to the kingdom's growing commercial economy, its productive agricultural regions, and its position within international trade networks connecting the British Isles with continental Europe. The documentary evidence for the Templars' initial establishment in England remains fragmentary and subject to scholarly interpretation, with various chronicles and charters providing partial information that must be carefully evaluated for reliability and chronological precision. The earliest definitive evidence appears to be a charter from around 1000 128, granting property in London, to the order, though some historians have suggested that informal Templar presence in England may have preceded formal institutional establishment. The location of this early London property, in the area known as Holborn, on the western edge of the growing city, provided access to both urban commercial opportunities and agricultural lands that could support a small community. The choice of London as the primary English base reflected both the city's status as England's largest urban centre and commercial hub, and its proximity to Westminster, where royal government increasingly concentrated its administrative activities. The development of London during the 12th century, with its expanding population, growing commercial activities, and increasingly sophisticated urban infrastructure, created opportunities for religious institutions to establish themselves within networks of patronage and economic exchange that characterized urban religious life. The physical development of the first Templar establishment in London, based on archaeological investigations and documentary references, reveals the gradual expansion of facilities as the order's English operations grew during the 1130s and 1140s. The initial compound apparently included basic residential buildings for housing the small community of Templar brothers, a chapel for conducting required religious services, and various support structures necessary for maintaining a functioning household. The architectural style of these early buildings, insofar as it can be reconstructed from limited evidence, appears to have followed conventional Romanesque patterns current in contemporary English ecclesiastical construction, without the distinctive features that would characterize later Templar architecture. The modest scale of the initial London establishment reflects the order's limited resources and personnel during its early years in England, before the accumulation of properties and donations that would eventually make the Templars one of England's wealthier ecclesiastical institutions. The gradual expansion of the Holborn site during the following decades, documented through various property transactions and building activities, indicates steady growth in the order's English operations and financial capabilities. The pattern of Templar expansion beyond London during the second quarter of the 12th century reveals strategic thinking about the geographical distribution of properties and the practical requirements for effective estate management. The establishment of preceptories, the term used for major Templar administrative centres in various regions of England, created networks of properties that could be supervised by resident communities of Templar brothers, while generating revenues through agricultural production, rents from tenant farmers, and various commercial activities. The Yorkshire properties, including significant holdings around the settlements that would become major Templar centres, positioned the order to exploit the agricultural and pastoral resources of northern England, while maintaining presence in regions where significant Norman aristocratic families could provide patronage and political support. The documentary evidence for these early acquisitions, preserved in various charter collections and monastic cartularies, reveals the mechanisms through which the Templars obtained properties, including outright donations from pious benefactors, purchases using funds sent from the order's international headquarters, and exchanges with other landholders seeking to consolidate their own estates. The relationship between the Templars and the English aristocracy during this formative period involved complex negotiations over property rights, spiritual benefits, and social prestige that characterized medieval gift-giving practices. Aristocratic donors, who granted lands or other assets to the Templars, expected spiritual returns, including prayers for their souls and the souls of their relatives, public recognition of their pious generosity, and association with a prestigious international religious order connected to the defense of Christianity's holiest sites. The documentary formulas employed in donation charters typically specified these spiritual benefits in detail, listing the souls for whom prayers were requested and emphasizing the donor's pious motivations rather than any material considerations. The social prestige associated with Templar patronage reflected the order's growing reputation and its connections to the crusading movement, which represented the highest expression of martial piety in 12th century European culture. Some aristocratic families developed ongoing relationships with particular Templar houses, making multiple donations over time and sometimes choosing burial in Templar chapels as expressions of their devotion and desire for the spiritual benefits associated with proximity to the order's religious activities. The reign of King Stephen, from 1135 to 1154, created political conditions that significantly affected the Templars' English operations, though in complex ways that combined new opportunities with increased uncertainties. Stephen's contested succession following Henry I's death, challenged by Empress Matilda, who claimed the throne based on her father's designation, initiated a prolonged civil conflict that contemporaries termed the Anarchy due to the breakdown of centralized royal authority and the resulting local violence and disorder. The conflict between Stephen and Matilda created situations where both parties sought to secure support through grants of lands and privileges, potentially benefiting recipients like the Templars, who could receive donations from competing factions. However, the general breakdown of order and the proliferation of unauthorized castle building and private warfare created dangerous conditions that threatened property rights and disrupted the agricultural production and commercial activities that supported monastic institutions. The Templars' international character and religious status provided some protection against the worst depredations of the Civil War, as even the most lawless elements of society generally respected ecclesiastical immunities and avoided direct attacks on recognized religious institutions. The documentary evidence from the Stephen's reign reveals continuing Templar expansion in England, despite political instability, suggesting that the order successfully navigated the challenges of civil conflict while taking advantage of opportunities created by political competition. Various charters from this period record donations to the Templars from supporters of both Stephen and Matilda, indicating that the order maintained working relationships with both factions and avoided exclusive identification with either party. This political flexibility, while prudent from the Templars' institutional perspective, reflected broader patterns in medieval political culture, where religious institutions attempted to maintain neutral positions during secular conflicts while accepting patronage from all parties. The specific properties acquired during this period included both agricultural estates and urban holdings, continuing the pattern of diversified landholding that characterized Templar economic strategy. The administrative challenges of managing these scattered properties during a period of political instability required the development of effective oversight mechanisms and the recruitment of capable personnel who could protect the order's interests. While maintaining productive operations, the accession of Henry II in 1154, ending the Civil War and initiating a period of strengthened royal government and legal reform, created more stable conditions that benefited the Templars' economic operations, while potentially increasing royal scrutiny of ecclesiastical privileges and immunities. Henry, who controlled an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, through combinations of inheritance, marriage, and conquest, brought to the English throne administrative capabilities and political ambitions that would transform English governance. His legal reforms, systematized through the Assize of Clarendon and other legislative enactments, created more consistent judicial procedures and expanded royal justice, at the expense of various private jurisdictions, including those claimed by ecclesiastical institutions. The Templars' claims to legal immunities and exemptions from ordinary royal jurisdiction, based on papal privileges and royal charters, required ongoing negotiation and occasional litigation to maintain in the face of Henry's general policy of strengthening royal authority and limiting competing jurisdictions. The documentary evidence from Henry II's reign reveals periodic conflicts between royal officials and the Templars over specific jurisdictional questions, though these disputes generally resulted in compromises that preserved the core of Templar privileges while acknowledging certain royal prerogatives. The economic prosperity that characterized much of Henry II's reign, resulting from restored political stability and continued expansion of commercial activities, created favorable conditions for the Templars' agricultural and commercial operations. The growth of urban markets for agricultural products encouraged investment in improved farming techniques and specialization in profitable crops or livestock, while the expansion of international trade networks created opportunities for profit through involvement in commercial transactions. The Templars' properties in eastern England, particularly in regions with access to ports and navigable rivers, positioned the order advantageously for participating in the wool trade that was beginning its transformation into England's most valuable export commodity. The technical requirements for successful wool production, including knowledge of sheep breeding, pasture management, and wool processing, represented accumulated expertise that the Templars developed through practical experience and possibly through contacts with other wool-producing regions, including the Cistercian monasteries, whose pastoral operations had achieved considerable commercial success. The relationship between the Templars and the Cistercian order, whose English expansion had occurred somewhat earlier during the 1120s and 1130s, involved both cooperation and competition, shaped by their similar economic activities and overlapping geographical presence. The Cistercians' emphasis on agricultural self-sufficiency and their development of extensive sheep farming operations created a partially competitive situation where both orders sought optimal grazing lands and access to commercial markets. However, the different primary missions of the two orders, the Cistercians focused on contemplative monasticism, while the Templars combined religious observance with military service, meant that direct institutional conflicts remained relatively rare. The architectural and agricultural innovations developed by Cistercian communities, including distinctive building techniques and systems for managing granges or outlying farms, may have influenced Templar practices, though the documentary evidence for direct technological transfer remains limited. The presence of both orders in various regions of England contributed to the broader transformation of English agriculture during the 12th century, as monastic institutions invested in drainage projects, land clearance, and improved farming techniques that increased productivity and commercialization. The development of the Templars' second London headquarters, the New Temple, initiated during the 1160s and continuing through the following decades, represented the most ambitious architectural project undertaken by the order in England and demonstrated the wealth and confidence the Templars had accumulated during their first decades of English operations. The decision to relocate from the increasingly cramped Holborn site to a larger property between London and Westminster reflected both practical needs for expanded facilities and symbolic aspirations to create an architectural statement worthy of the order's international prestige. The acquisition of the land for the new temple, involving negotiations with various property holders and royal approval for development in an area with connections to royal jurisdiction, required significant financial resources and political connections. The planning and construction of the new complex, extending over several decades, created employment for numerous craftsmen and labourers while requiring organisational capabilities for coordinating complex building projects involving multiple structures and sophisticated architectural features. The Temple Church, the centrepiece of the new temple complex, represents one of medieval England's most architecturally significant ecclesiastical buildings and demonstrates the Templars' ambitions to create structures rivaling those of the kingdom's most prestigious religious institutions. The church's distinctive circular nave, inspired by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, employed architectural forms laden with symbolic meaning relating to the resurrection and the Templars' connection to the holy sites they were pledged to defend. The construction techniques visible in the surviving structure, including the use of Purbeck marble for decorative elements, sophisticated stone vaulting systems, and carefully planned proportions and measurements, indicate employment of master masons with extensive technical knowledge and artistic capabilities. The quality of carved stone decoration, including the famous grotesque figures and geometric patterns adorning capitals and doorways, represents high-quality sculptural work comparable to contemporary cathedral construction projects. The consecration of the church in February 1185, attended by King Henry II, the Patriarch Heraclius of Jerusalem, and numerous English nobles and ecclesiastical dignitaries demonstrated the Templars' successful integration into the highest levels of English society and their ability to command royal attention and participation in their religious ceremonies. The architectural complex surrounding the Temple Church included residential buildings for housing the Templar community, administrative offices, storage facilities, stables, and various support structures necessary for maintaining a large institutional household. Archaeological investigations of the Temple precinct, though complicated by subsequent rebuilding and modern development, have revealed evidence for the layout and functions of these various buildings. The residential quarters apparently included both communal dormitories for ordinary members and separate accommodations for visiting dignitaries or members of higher rank, reflecting hierarchical social distinctions within the order, despite its theoretical commitment to humble living. The administrative buildings house the records and financial operations that manage the Templars' extensive English properties, with document storage facilities protecting the charters, accounts, and correspondence that documented the order's legal rights and economic transactions. The stables, essential for an order whose military identity centered on heavy cavalry warfare, provided accommodation for the high-quality horses necessary for combat service and the various draft animals required for agricultural and transport operations. The financial services that the Temple in London began providing during the later 12th century represented evolutionary development, from basic property management into sophisticated banking operations that would eventually make the Templars indispensable to English royal finance. The initial impetus for these financial activities derived from the practical problems of transferring funds between England and the Crusader states, as donations collected in England needed to be converted into usable resources for the order's military operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. The solutions developed for this internal institutional need, involving bills of exchange, letters of credit, and various accounting mechanisms, proved applicable to broader financial challenges facing merchants, pilgrims, and eventually royal governments. The Temple's reputation for honest dealing and its international network of houses that could honor financial instruments issued at distant locations made it attractive for clients requiring secure fund transfers or storage facilities. For valuables, the physical security provided by the Temple precinct, with its substantial stone buildings, controlled access points, and resident community of warrior monks, made it among the most secure locations in London for storing treasure, documents, and other valuables. The development of specialized treasure storage facilities within the Temple complex, including reinforced rooms and strongboxes designed to resist theft, represented capital investments in infrastructure supporting financial services. The procedures governing deposits and withdrawals, documented in various surviving accounts and chronicles, apparently involved careful record-keeping and multiple levels of authorization to prevent fraud or unauthorized access. The fees charged for storage services provided the Templars with revenue streams that did not depend on agricultural production or property rents, diversifying the order's income sources while creating financial relationships with wealthy clients who might later become donors or political supporters. The Crown's use of the Temple as a treasury and financial headquarters developed gradually during Henry II's reign and became increasingly systematic under his successors Richard I and John. The advantages for royal government included the security and accounting capabilities already mentioned, plus the Templars' political position as an international religious order whose interests did not align neatly with any English aristocratic faction. The deposit of crown jewels, important state documents, and royal treasure at the Temple removed these valuable items from potential seizure during political conflicts, while maintaining their accessibility for royal use when needed. The Templars' role in managing royal revenues, collecting certain taxes, making payments on the Crown's behalf, and providing short-term credit during revenue shortfalls transformed the order into a crucial component of royal financial administration. The documentary evidence for these financial services appears extensively in governmental records from the late 12th and 13th centuries, with frequent references to transactions conducted at the Temple and payments authorized by Templar officials acting on royal instructions. The crusading expedition of Richard I, whose preparation and conduct between 1189 and 1192 represented the largest military undertaking by an English monarch to that date, demonstrated both the Templars' logistical capabilities and their integration into the highest levels of royal government and military planning. Richard's commitment to crusading, which had motivated his participation in the Third Crusade even before his accession to the English throne, led him to view the Templars as natural allies and essential resources for his expedition. The financial preparations for the crusade involved extraordinary taxation measures, including the Saladin tithe, a levy of 10% on movable property throughout England that generated unprecedented revenues, but also required sophisticated collection and management systems. The Templars assisted in administering these special taxes, providing accounting expertise and secure storage for the funds collected, while preparing logistical support for transporting these resources to the crusade theatre. Richard's personal relationship with the Templar order, developed through his crusading activities and his reliance on their financial services, led to additional grants of properties and privileges that expanded the order's English holdings and strengthened its position within English society. The pattern of royal donations during Richard's reign included both outright grants of lands and confirmations of privileges previously granted by earlier monarchs, creating cumulative layers of legal protection for Templar rights. The specific properties granted by Richard included estates in various counties, urban holdings, and various commercial rights, including market tolls and fishing weirs that could generate regular income. The confirmations of privileges addressed jurisdictional immunities, tax exemptions, and various other special statuses that differentiated the Templars from ordinary landholders and protected them from certain forms of royal or local governmental intervention. The political crisis created by Richard's capture during his return from crusade and the extended period of his captivity in Germany from 1192 to 1194 placed enormous financial burdens on England as the ransom demanded. For the king's release exceeded normal royal revenues by substantial margins. The collection of ransom funds required cooperation from all sectors of English society, including ecclesiastical institutions like the Templars, who contributed from their English resources while facilitating the complex financial transactions necessary for transferring the ransom to Richard's captors. The Templars' international connections and financial expertise proved valuable for arranging the actual payment mechanisms, which involved coordinating transfers across multiple jurisdictions and converting various forms of wealth into the gold and silver required by the ransom agreement. The successful conclusion of these ransom negotiations and Richard's return to England in 1194 demonstrated both the Templars' capabilities and the kingdom's ability to mobilize extraordinary resources when necessary, though the financial burden created long-term economic difficulties that affected subsequent royal policy. The accession of King John in 1199, following Richard's death from wounds received during a minor military campaign in France, initiated a reign that would witness both the zenith of Templar involvement in English royal finance and the beginning of political developments that would eventually contribute to questioning the order's role and privileges. John's reputation, coloured by both contemporary criticism and later historical interpretation, presents him as an able administrator whose tactical political skills were undermined by strategic miscalculations and personality defects that alienated crucial supporters. His reliance on the Templars for financial management became even more pronounced than his predecessors had been, as John's expensive military campaigns and political difficulties created continuous needs for sophisticated financial operations. The Temple in London served as the primary repository for crown jewels and treasure throughout John's reign, with frequent documentary references to deposits, withdrawals, and inventories of royal valuables stored there under Templar custody. The Templars' role as financial intermediaries became particularly crucial during John's conflicts with Pope Innocent III, which led to England's placement under papal interdict from 1208 to 1214. The interdict, prohibiting the celebration of most religious services throughout England, created awkward situations for the Templars, whose international obligations and papal connections meant they theoretically should observe the interdict, while their financial relationships with John required maintaining working relationships with the excommunicated king. The order's solution apparently involved limiting their cooperation with John to purely financial and administrative matters, while avoiding actions that could be interpreted as explicit support for his defiance of papal authority. This delicate balancing act demonstrated the Templars' skill at navigating complex political situations, where their various obligations and interests created potential conflicts, though it also revealed the tensions inherent in serving both papal and royal masters whose interests might diverge. The baronial opposition to John that developed during the early 1210s and culminated in the Magna Carta crisis of 1215 placed the Templars in similarly difficult positions, where their close association with royal finance made them potentially suspect in the eyes of rebellious barons. The barons' complaints against John included objections to various forms of arbitrary taxation and financial extraction that directly affected their economic interests and challenged traditional understandings of proper royal behavior. The Templars' involvement in administering royal finances meant they had participated in implementing some of the policies that generated baronial resentment, though their role as agents rather than principals in these matters provided some protection against direct baronial hostility. The negotiations between John and the barons during 1215, conducted through various intermediaries and involving complex discussions of legal principles and political compromises, apparently included some Templar participation, though the extent and nature of their involvement remains unclear from surviving evidence. The location of the Magna Carta negotiations at Runnymede in June 1215 held significance partly because this meadow beside the Thames lay near Templar properties at that location, suggesting possible Templar facilitation of the meeting, even if they did not actively participate in the negotiations themselves. The Charter's provisions included various clauses addressing royal financial practices and baronial rights that indirectly affected the Templars' position as royal financial agents, though the order was not specifically mentioned in the document's text. The political crisis following John's repudiation of Magna Carta and the subsequent civil war between royalist and baronial forces created conditions where the Templars' continued custody of royal treasure and their financial operations on John's behalf identified them with the royalist cause, potentially exposing them to baronial retaliation if the rebellion succeeded. The ultimate resolution of the civil war, following John's death in October 1216, and the accession of his young son, Henry III, removed some of these immediate political pressures while creating new challenges associated with the governance during a royal minority. The regency government established for the young Henry III, led initially by the elderly but still formidable William Marshal, and subsequently by other magnates, maintained the Templars' role in royal financial administration, while working to restore political stability after the disruptions of John's final years. Marshal's own close connections to the Templars, developed through his crusading activities, and his general reputation as an exemplar of chivalric virtue, helped ensure continuity in the order's relationship with royal government. The elderly Marshal's decision to take Templar vows on his deathbed in May 1219 represented both personal piety and public recognition of the order's spiritual prestige, while his burial in the Temple Church provided that building with one of medieval England's most prestigious tomb monuments. The elaborate effigy depicting Marshal in full knightly regalia, carved from Purbeck marble by skilled sculptors, represents high-quality medieval funerary art and serves as a permanent memorial to the connections between England's aristocratic military elite and the military religious orders. The minority of Henry III, lasting until the King's declaration of majority in 1227, involved complex political manoeuvring among various aristocratic factions, competing for influence over royal government and access to the resources controlled in the King's name. The Templars' custody of royal treasure and their role in financial administration gave them significant practical power during this period, though they generally exercised this power cautiously to avoid becoming identified with any particular political faction. The documentary evidence from the minority period reveals continuing Templar involvement in routine governmental financial operations, including collection and disbursement of revenues, management of royal estates, and provision of credit, when immediate cash was needed for urgent expenses. The order's reputation for competent financial management and its theoretical political neutrality made it valuable for a regency government that needed to maintain governmental functions while managing delicate political situations, involving powerful magnates with competing interests. The agricultural operations conducted on Templar estates throughout England during the 13th century reflected both the general expansion of agricultural production that characterized this period of European economic growth, specific management practices that military religious orders developed through accumulated experience and institutional continuity. The documentary evidence for Templar agricultural activities, preserved in estate accounts, manorial surveys, and various legal records, reveals sophisticated approaches to land management that balance direct cultivation of demesne lands with rental arrangements for tenant farms. The demesne lands, typically consisting of the most productive acreage and worked by hired labourers or customary tenants owing labour services, produced grain crops, primarily wheat and barley that could be sold in commercial markets or used to supply the order's own communities. The investment in agricultural infrastructure, including barns, granaries, mills, and specialized processing facilities, represented capital commitments that improved productivity and enabled the Templars to participate effectively in increasingly commercialized agricultural markets. The pastoral operations on Templar estates, particularly in regions suitable for sheep farming, positioned the order as significant participants in England's expanding wool trade during the 13th century. The growth of Flemish and Italian textile manufacturing created unprecedented demand for high-quality English wool, transforming sheep farming from a subsidiary agricultural activity into a major commercial enterprise. The Templars' properties in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and other regions with extensive pasture lands developed substantial sheep flocks that supplied wool to both domestic and continental markets. The technical requirements for successful sheep farming, including selective breeding to improve wool quality, pasture management to maintain adequate grazing, prevention and treatment of livestock diseases, and proper timing of shearing and wool processing, represented accumulated expertise that the Templars developed through practical experience. The documentary evidence for Templar wool production includes periodic references in estate accounts to flock sizes, wool yields, and prices received for wool sales, though the surviving records remain too fragmentary to permit comprehensive quantitative analysis of the order's total involvement in the wool trade. The commercial activities conducted by the Templars extended beyond agricultural production to include various urban enterprises, money-lending operations, and participation in international trade networks that connected England with continental markets. The order's urban properties, concentrated primarily in London, but including holdings in various provincial towns, generated rental income from commercial tenants, while providing the Templars with access to urban markets and commercial information. The specific types of urban properties held by the Templars included residential buildings rented to various tenants, commercial structures, housing shops or workshops, and specialized facilities such as mills and brew houses that produced commodities for sale in urban markets. The management of these urban holdings required different expertise than agricultural estate management, including knowledge of commercial law, urban customs, and market conditions that affected rental values and commercial opportunities. The financial operations conducted by the Templars expanded during the 13th century from simple deposit and storage services into more complex credit arrangements that functioned as rudimentary banking services. The mechanisms for providing credit to various clients, including the Crown, aristocratic borrowers, and commercial enterprises, apparently involved loans secured by pledged properties or future revenues, with fees or interest charges structured to avoid direct violation of canonical prohibitions against usury. The technical arrangements for circumventing usury restrictions, while still charging for the use of money, involved various legal fictions and carefully structured transactions that contemporaries recognized as essentially circumventing the spirit, if not the letter, of canon law. The Templars' international network enabled them to provide services that other lenders could not match, particularly regarding fund transfers between different locations and credit arrangements that could be honored at distant Templar houses. The question of whether the Templars' financial activities constituted banking in any modern sense remains subject to scholarly debate, with interpretations varying depending on how precisely one defines banking and which specific financial instruments and practices are considered essential to that definition. The Templars clearly provided deposit services, fund transfers, and various forms of credit that resembled banking functions, though the scale and sophistication of these operations remained limited compared to the specialized banking houses that would emerge in Italian cities during the later medieval period. The institutional advantages the Templars possessed for financial operations included their international network, their reputation for reliability, their secure facilities, and their exemption from certain legal restrictions that limited other potential lenders. However, the Order's primary identity remained that of a military religious organization rather than a financial institution, and their banking activities always represented subsidiary functions supporting their main crusading mission rather than ends in themselves. The judicial privileges claimed by the Templars, based on various papal grants and royal confirmations, created ongoing jurisdictional disputes with both royal officials and ecclesiastical authorities throughout the Order's English existence. The exemption from episcopal jurisdiction, granted by papal bulls and confirmed by successive popes, meant that English bishops could not exercise normal disciplinary authority over Templar houses within their diocese, or interfere in the Order's internal affairs. This exemption generated periodic conflicts when bishops attempted to assert authority over Templar chapels, questioned the Order's burial practices, or challenged Templar claims to tithe exemptions. The documentary evidence for these disputes appears in episcopal registers, papal correspondence, and various legal proceedings, where competing jurisdictional claims were argued and adjudicated. The resolutions of these conflicts generally upheld core Templar privileges, while establishing boundaries that limited the most expansive interpretations of the Order's immunities. The Templars' claims to exemption from certain forms of royal taxation and legal jurisdiction created similar tensions with royal government, particularly during periods when the Crown sought to maximize revenues from all possible sources. The theoretical basis for these exemptions rested on the Order's religious character and its dedication to crusading service, which contemporaries recognized as benefiting all of Christendom rather than serving any particular secular ruler's interests. However, the practical application of these principles to specific situations remained subject to negotiation and interpretation, with both the Templars and royal officials advancing arguments supporting their respective positions. The pattern of resolution that emerged through accumulated precedents and case-by-case determinations created a complex body of customary law, defining the practical scope of Templar privileges in specific situations while leaving broader questions of principle unresolved. The relationship between the Templars and the English Jewish community, though poorly documented in surviving sources, involved complex economic and social interactions shaped by the broader framework of Christian-Jewish relations in medieval England. The Jewish community's role as providers of credit services that canonical restrictions theoretically prevented Christians from offering created economic niches where Jewish and Christian financial operators necessarily interacted. The Templars' own involvement in credit provision and their participation in commercial networks where Jewish merchants and financiers operated meant that some level of interaction was inevitable, though the specific nature and extent of these contacts remains largely invisible in surviving records. The theological framework within which the Templars operated included traditional Christian supersessionist attitudes toward Judaism and Jews, though the extent to which these theological positions affected practical economic relationships remains unclear. The broader social context of Anglo-Jewish relations during the 13th century, including periodic outbreaks of anti-Jewish violence, royal exploitation of Jewish wealth, through arbitrary taxation and periodic expulsions, and growing restrictions on Jewish economic activities, created an increasingly hostile environment that would culminate in the final expulsion of Jews from England in 1290. The Templars' position within this context remains ambiguous due to limited documentation, though their financial activities and urban presence would have brought them into proximity with Jewish communities in London and other towns where both groups operated. The absence of evidence for either particularly close cooperation or exceptional hostility between Templars and Jews suggests that their relationship probably fell within the normal range of Christian-Jewish interactions in medieval English urban settings, characterized by necessary economic contacts conducted within frameworks of religious separation and legal inequality. The military training and readiness maintained by English Templars, though rarely directly documented in surviving sources, represented essential components of the order's identity and institutional purpose, despite the fact that most English Templars never actually participated in crusading campaigns. The archaeological evidence from Templar sites, including discoveries of weapons, armor fragments, and architectural features associated with military training, provides material confirmation that English preceptories maintained facilities and equipment for martial exercises. The specific training regimens probably included regular practice with weapons, particularly swords and lances, mounted combat exercises requiring coordination between rider and horse, and possibly tactical drills, practicing the coordinated maneuvers specified in the order's military regulations. The quality and extent of this training likely varied considerably, depending on individual preceptories' resources and the military experience of senior members who would supervise training activities. The horses maintained on Templar estates served both agricultural and military purposes, with careful breeding programs aimed at producing animals suitable for heavy cavalry warfare alongside the draft animals needed for agricultural work and transportation. The destriers or war horses required for mounted combat represented substantial investments due to their specialized breeding, extensive training, and the costs of maintaining animals that consumed large quantities of expensive fodder. The documentary evidence for Templar horse breeding operations appears in estate accounts that record numbers of horses, their categorization by type and quality, and the expenses associated with their maintenance. The technical expertise required for breeding and training war horses represented specialized knowledge that the Templars accumulated through practical experience, with senior members passing their expertise to younger brothers through apprenticeship style. The arms and armor maintained by the Templars conformed to contemporary standards for heavy cavalry equipment, while displaying distinctive features that marked them as belonging to a religious military order. The white mantles emblazoned with red crosses that became the Templars' most recognizable visual markers served both practical identification purposes in combat and symbolic functions representing the order's religious character. The manufacturing of these distinctive garments required specialized textile production capabilities and ongoing supplies of appropriate fabrics and dyes. The weapons maintained by the Templars included swords manufactured according to current metallurgical techniques, lances designed for mounted shock combat, various types of daggers and secondary weapons, and potentially crossbows for siege warfare or defensive operations. The armor evolved throughout the order's existence, reflecting technological developments in protective equipment from mail hauberks in the 12th century toward the more comprehensive plate armor that began appearing during the 13th century. The logistical support required for maintaining military readiness extended beyond weapons and horses to include extensive supplies of food, fodder, replacement equipment, and various materials needed for extended campaigns. The Templars' economic operations in England existed primarily to generate revenues that could support the order's military activities in the Crusader states, requiring efficient systems for converting agricultural production and commercial profits into usable military supplies. The mechanisms for transferring these resources from England to the Eastern Mediterranean involved complex coordination between English preceptories, the Order's continental houses, and its headquarters in the Holy Land. The documentary evidence for these resource transfers appears occasionally in accounts and correspondence, though the fragmentary nature of surviving records prevents comprehensive reconstruction of the full scope of England's contributions to the Order's military operations. The recruitment of new members into the English Templars followed procedures established in the Order's rule while adapting to local circumstances and the specific needs of English operations. The candidates for admission came from various social backgrounds, with knights recruited from the aristocratic and gentry classes, sergeants from somewhat lower social strata, and various specialized brothers from backgrounds appropriate to their intended functions. The screening of potential members involved investigation of their family background, assessment of their physical capabilities and moral character, vows, and verification that they were not already bound by marriage vows or obligations to other religious orders. The admission ceremonies, conducted according to prescribed rituals specified in the rule, involved elaborate procedures, emphasizing the candidate's renunciation of secular life and acceptance of the Order's religious discipline and military obligations. The daily routine in English Templar preceptories combined religious observances with agricultural labor, administrative duties, and maintenance of military readiness in proportions that varied according to each house's size, location, and economic activities. The religious schedule specified in the Order's rule required attendance at daily masses, recitation of prescribed prayers at canonical hours throughout the day, and participation in various liturgical observances marking the ecclesiastical calendar. The balance between these religious obligations and the practical work needed to maintain productive agricultural operations required careful scheduling and division of labor among community members. The documentary and archaeological evidence for daily life in Templar preceptories reveals the physical infrastructure supporting these activities, including chapels for religious services, dormitories for communal sleeping, refectories where meals were consumed, and various work buildings housing agricultural and craft activities. The dietary regulations governing Templar communities prescribed a primarily vegetarian diet, with meat allowed on specified days, following monastic customs that emphasized restraint and avoidance of luxury, while ensuring adequate nutrition for men engaged in physically demanding work. The specific provisions of the Templar rule regarding food included detailed specifications about meal timing, the types and quantities of food provided to members of different ranks, and the proper conduct during meals, including required silence or approved conversation. The agricultural operations on Templar estates provided most basic foodstuffs consumed in their communities, including bread, grains, vegetables, dairy products, and meat from livestock raised on the Order's properties. The supplementary purchases of specialty items, including wine, spices, salt, and various luxury goods permitted under the rule's allowances, appear in surviving account records, revealing patterns of consumption that generally conform to regulatory requirements, while showing some variations based on local availability and economic circumstances. The archaeological investigation of food remains from Templar sites has provided detailed information about actual dietary practices, revealing consumption patterns through analysis of animal bones, plant remains, and other organic materials preserved in archaeological deposits. The bone assemblages from Templar sites indicate consumption of beef, pork, mutton, poultry, and fish in proportions, reflecting both religious dietary requirements and the productive capacities of agricultural estates. The analysis of butchery patterns visible on animal bones reveals information about meat processing techniques, the selection of particular cuts for consumption, and potentially the social distribution of higher quality versus lower quality meat portions within Templar communities. The recovery of fish bones and mollusk shells indicates consumption of both freshwater and marine species, with some evidence suggesting that high-status fish species were consumed on important religious festivals, while more common fish provided protein during the numerous fast days prescribed by the ecclesiastical calendar. The clothing and personal equipment provided to Templars followed standardized specifications designed to maintain appropriate monastic simplicity while ensuring practical functionality for religious observances, agricultural work, and potential military service. The distinctive white mantles worn by Knight brothers served as the order's most recognizable visual identifier, while symbolizing the purity expected of religious warriors dedicated to Christ's service. The sergeant brothers wore darker mantles, typically brown or black, maintaining visual distinction between the two primary ranks of fighting brothers. The rule specified additional clothing items, including tunics, breeches, cloaks for cold weather, and various accessories appropriate for different activities and seasons. The archaeological evidence for Templar clothing and textiles remains limited due to the poor preservation of organic materials. Though occasional finds of fabric fragments, metal fasteners, and other dress accessories provide material confirmation of documentary descriptions, the production and acquisition of textiles and clothing required ongoing investment in both raw materials and labor, representing significant components of preceptory operating expenses. Some Templar estates maintained facilities for textile production, including sheep, whose wool was processed into cloth rather than sold as raw material. Though the extent of this domestic production versus purchasing cloth from commercial suppliers varied according to local circumstances, the manufacture of the distinctive mantles, with their embroidered red crosses, required specialized skills in both weaving and needlework, likely necessitating employment of professional craftsmen. Rather than relying solely on the brothers' own labor, the maintenance of clothing standards specified in the rule required periodic inspection and enforcement by preceptory officials, with disciplinary procedures addressing violations of dress requirements that might indicate pride or excessive concern with worldly appearance. The architectural development of Templar preceptories throughout England reflected both practical requirements for housing religious communities and symbolic aspirations to create buildings worthy of the order's prestige and spiritual mission. The larger preceptories developed over time into substantial complexes, including churches or chapels, residential buildings, administrative structures, agricultural facilities, and defensive features appropriate to the uncertain security conditions of medieval England. The architectural styles employed in Templar construction generally followed contemporary English ecclesiastical building traditions, with Romanesque features characterizing earlier 12th century construction, and Gothic elements appearing in 13th century building campaigns. The specific architectural choices made at individual sites reflected local building traditions, the availability of particular construction materials, and the resources available for building projects at different periods. The churches and chapels constructed at major Templar sites demonstrate the order's commitment to maintaining appropriate facilities for religious observances while creating architecturally significant buildings that could serve as visual statements of Templar presence and prestige. The round nave design employed at the London Temple Church and apparently replicated at some other major Templar sites consciously imitated the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, creating direct architectural connections to the holy sites the order was pledged to defend. This distinctive architectural form, relatively unusual in English ecclesiastical building, made Templar churches immediately recognizable and emphasized the order's special relationship to the Holy Land. The construction techniques and decorative programs employed in these churches indicate access to skilled master masons and craftsmen capable of executing sophisticated architectural projects comparable to contemporary cathedral, monastic church construction. The residential buildings at Templar preceptories provided accommodation appropriate to the order's commitment to communal living and monastic discipline, while acknowledging practical distinctions between members of different ranks and functions. The dormitories housing ordinary brothers typically featured communal sleeping arrangements, with individual beds or sleeping platforms arranged in large halls, maintaining the visibility and supervision that monastic regulations required to prevent immoral behavior. The accommodation for preceptory commanders and visiting dignitaries included separate chambers, providing greater privacy while remaining relatively modest by contemporary aristocratic standards. The archaeological evidence for residential structures, including foundation remains and occasional surviving portions of walls or architectural features, reveals building plans and construction techniques while providing limited information about internal furnishings or decoration that would have been largely organic materials now lost to decay. The administrative buildings, housing the records, financial operations, and command functions of major Templar establishments, represented crucial infrastructure for managing the order's extensive properties and commercial activities. The storage facilities for documents and treasure required secure, weatherproof construction, protecting valuable materials from both theft and environmental damage. The development of specialized document storage systems, potentially including wooden chests, wall cupboards, or dedicated archive rooms, reflects the growing volume of charters, accounts, and correspondence that accumulated as the Templars' English operations expanded. The financial operations conducted in these administrative centers required spaces suitable for receiving clients, conducting confidential business, and maintaining the records essential for tracking complex transactions. The archaeological investigation of administrative buildings at Templar sites has occasionally revealed architectural features, suggesting specialized functions, including strong rooms with reinforced construction and secure access controls. The agricultural buildings at Templar estates included the full range of structures necessary for productive farming operations, including barns for storing grain and hay, stables, housing livestock and working animals, processing facilities for converting agricultural raw materials into usable products, and various specialized structures supporting particular agricultural activities. The barn construction employed timber framing techniques characteristic of medieval English agricultural architecture, creating substantial buildings capable of protecting harvested crops from weather and pests, while providing workspace for threshing and other processing activities. The surviving examples of medieval barns at former Templar sites, though often extensively modified or rebuilt in subsequent periods, occasionally preserve architectural features indicating original construction dates and building techniques. The scale and quality of agricultural buildings varied considerably depending on the economic importance and productive capacity of different estates, with major properties receiving substantial capital investment in infrastructure, while smaller holdings made do with more modest facilities. The defensive features incorporated into Templar preceptories reflected the order's military character and the genuine security concerns arising from England's occasionally turbulent political conditions. The extent of defensive construction varied considerably, with some sites developing substantial fortifications, including curtain walls, gatehouse towers, and other features characteristic of castle architecture, while others relied on more modest enclosures and the defensive advantages of stone construction. The construction of fortifications required royal licenses under English law, as unauthorized castle building represented potential threats to royal authority and public order. The documentary evidence for Templar castle building reveals occasional royal permissions for fortification projects, suggesting that at least some Templar sites received explicit authorization for military-style construction. The archaeological investigation of defensive features at Templar sites has revealed various approaches to security, ranging from substantial stone walls with towers to simpler enclosures, relying primarily on controlled access and the deterrent effect of the Templars' military reputation. The water management systems developed at Templar sites demonstrate sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering and the practical requirements for sustaining religious communities, agricultural operations, and potentially defensive needs. The provision of adequate clean water for drinking, cooking, sanitation, livestock, and various industrial processes required careful planning and often substantial engineering works. The construction of wells, occasionally reaching considerable depths to access reliable water sources, appears at numerous Templar sites, with surviving well structures sometimes displaying impressive masonry work. The development of water supply systems, drawing from springs or streams, involved conduits bringing water to site, sometimes across considerable distances, while drainage systems removed wastewater and prevented flooding of buildings and work areas. The archaeological evidence for these hydraulic features includes well shafts, drainage channels, water cisterns, and occasionally sophisticated systems of pipes or channels distributing water to different parts of preceptory complexes. The mills operated by the Templars on their estates represented both important sources of revenue and technologically sophisticated installations, requiring substantial capital investment and specialized expertise to maintain. The watermills used for grinding grain into flour employed complex mechanical systems, harnessing water power to turn heavy millstones, while windmills beginning to appear in England during the late 12th century offered alternative power sources in areas lacking suitable watercourses. The construction and maintenance of these mills required millwrights possessing specialized knowledge of gearing systems, power transmission, and the precise shaping of millstones for effective grinding. The documentary evidence for Templar mills appears in various sources, including estate accounts recording milling revenues, legal disputes over water rights affecting mill operations, and occasional building accounts documenting mill construction or repair. The monopoly rights over milling that the Templars exercised in some localities, requiring tenants to use the Lord's mill and pay prescribed fees, generated both revenues and occasional resentment from those compelled to use potentially expensive or inconvenient facilities. The woodland resources controlled by the Templars provided essential materials for construction, fuel, and various craft activities, while requiring careful management to ensure sustainable yields over time. The medieval understanding of woodland management, though lacking modern scientific forestry concepts, recognized the need to balance harvesting with regeneration and developed various techniques for maintaining productive forests. The coppicing systems employed for producing regularly sized poles and small timber involved cutting trees at ground level and allowing multiple stems to grow from the stump, creating renewable sources of wood for fencing, tool handles, and fuel. The documentary evidence for Templar woodland management appears in various records, including accounts specifying quantities of timber harvested, payments to Woodward, responsible for supervising forest use, and legal proceedings addressing unauthorized cutting or poaching in Templar woods. The economic value of woodland extended beyond timber to include pasturage rights for swine feeding on acorns and beechnuts during autumn months, hunting rights, providing game for consumption, and gathering of various forest products, including firewood, nuts, berries, and medicinal plants. The fishing operations conducted by the Templars from both inland and coastal properties provided protein for consumption while generating surplus for sale in commercial markets. The construction and maintenance of fish ponds at numerous Templar estates created controlled environments for raising freshwater fish species, particularly carp and pike, that could be harvested as needed to supply the community's dietary requirements. The engineering works necessary for creating effective fish ponds involved damming streams to create impoundments of sufficient size and depth, constructing overflow systems, preventing pond failure during floods, and potentially creating multiple connected ponds, allowing separation of fish by size or species. The management of fish ponds required specialized knowledge regarding stocking densities, feeding practices, and harvesting techniques that maximized yields while maintaining healthy fish populations. The documentary evidence for Templar fisheries includes periodic references in accounts to fish catches, sales of surplus fish, and expenses for maintaining ponds and fishing equipment. The coastal properties held by the Templars in various locations provided access to marine resources, including sea fisheries, salt production, and potentially shipping facilities, supporting commercial activities. The rights to fishing grounds along coastlines or in tidal estuaries generated revenues from lease payments by commercial fishermen, or from direct exploitation, using boats and equipment owned by the order. The production of salt through evaporation of seawater in coastal salt pans created valuable commodity essential for preserving food, with salt trade representing significant commercial activity in medieval economy. The documentary evidence for Templar involvement in salt production remains limited, though the order's possession of coastal properties in regions known for salt manufacture suggests at least some participation in this trade. The development of harbour facilities, or boat landing sites at coastal Templar properties, would have supported both fishing operations and broader commercial activities, though the archaeological evidence for such maritime installations remains largely unexplored. The craft production conducted on Templar estates and in workshops associated with urban properties included various specialized activities, producing both goods for the order's own use and products for commercial sale. The blacksmiths maintaining forges at Templar sites produced and repaired the iron tools essential for agricultural work, the horseshoes necessary for maintaining livestock, and potentially weapons and armor, though the production of military equipment more likely involved purchasing from specialized urban craftsmen. The documentary evidence for smithing activities appears in occasional account entries, recording payments for iron stock, coal for forges, and wages for smiths employed on particular projects. The textile crafts, including wool preparation, spinning, weaving, and dyeing, potentially occurred at some Templar sites, though the extent of domestic textile production versus purchasing finished cloth remains unclear. The production of the order's distinctive white and dark mantles would have required either in-house capability or close relationships with commercial textile workers who could produce to specified standards. The brewing operations conducted at Templar establishments produced the ale that formed a staple component of medieval diet, providing both nutrition and safe beverage alternative to potentially contaminated water. The malting of barley and subsequent fermentation processes required specialized facilities, including malting floors for sprouting grain, kilns for drying malt, and brewing vessels for combining malt with water and hops. The consumption of ale within Templar communities followed the standard medieval pattern, where even religious houses accepted ale as normal daily beverage, while reserving wine for religious ceremonies and special occasions. The documentary evidence for brewing appears in occasional references to malting facilities, purchases of hops, and employment of specialized brewers, though the routine nature of ale production meant it rarely received detailed documentation. The scale of brewing operations would have varied considerably depending on community size and whether ale was produced solely for internal consumption or also for commercial sale to generate additional revenues. The relationship between the Templars and the English monarchy during the long reign of Henry III, from 1216 to 1272, evolved through various phases, reflecting both the king's personal attitudes and the changing political circumstances affecting his government. The Regency period, during Henry's minority, saw continuation of established patterns of Templar involvement in royal finance and administration, with the order providing essential services while maintaining careful political neutrality among the competing aristocratic factions. Henry's assumption of personal rule in 1227 began a new phase, characterized initially by continued reliance on Templar financial expertise. To maximize revenues from all available sources, the political crises that erupted periodically during Henry's reign, resulting from his expensive continental campaigns, his lavish patronage of foreign relatives and advisors, and his conflicts with baronial opposition, created situations where the Templars' role as royal financial agents potentially exposed them to criticism from the king's opponents. The baronial reform movement that developed during the 1250s and culminated in the Provisions of Oxford in 1258 represented systematic attempts to limit royal authority and establish baronial oversight of governmental operations, including financial administration. The Templars' extensive involvement in managing royal revenues and their custody of crown treasure made them relevant to reform discussions, though the order's religious character and international connections provided some protection against direct baronial interference in their operations. The documentary evidence from this period reveals continuing Templar financial services to the crown, while political tensions created uncertain conditions affecting all major institutions. The capture of Henry III by Simon de Montfort's forces at the Battle of Lewes in 1264 temporarily shifted power to the baronial faction and created particularly delicate situations for the Templars, who maintained custody of royal treasure, while the king himself, was held prisoner by his opponents. The restoration of royal authority following Prince Edward's victory over the Montfortian forces at the Battle of Evesham in 1265 re-established more normal conditions, while Edward's demonstrated military capabilities and political skills suggested that the eventual succession would bring more effective royal leadership. The relationship between the future Edward I and the Templars, developed through Edward's participation in crusading activities during the early 1270s, combined personal knowledge of the order's military operations with shrewd assessment of their financial capabilities. Edward's crusading expedition to the Holy Land in 1270, though militarily unsuccessful in achieving lasting strategic gains, provided him with first-hand experience of conditions in the Crusader states and direct observation of the Templars' military organization and operational methods. This personal knowledge would inform Edward's subsequent policies toward the order after his accession to the English throne in 1272. The reign of Edward I, from 1272 to 1307, witnessed both continued Templar involvement in royal finance and increasing governmental scrutiny of ecclesiastical privileges and immunities that potentially reduced royal revenues. Edward's ambitious military campaigns in Wales and Scotland, his efforts to strengthen royal administration, and his comprehensive legislative programs created continuous demands for revenue that tested the capabilities of existing financial systems. The Templars' extensive landholdings and commercial operations made them potential targets for taxation schemes, while their claimed exemptions from certain forms of royal taxation generated investigations into whether these privileges were being abused or applied more broadly than legitimate papal grants authorized. The documentary evidence from Edward's reign reveals periodic tensions between royal officials seeking to maximize revenues and Templar administrators defending the order's traditional immunities, with resolutions generally establishing specific limitations on exempt categories, while acknowledging core privileges based on clear documentary evidence. The conquest of Wales and the subsequent campaigns in Scotland required unprecedented military mobilizations, drawing on resources from throughout Edward's domains, including England, Wales, Gascony, and Ireland. The logistical demands of supplying large armies operating in difficult terrain for extended periods created opportunities for the Templars to provide valuable services, including credit facilities, enabling the Crown to purchase supplies before revenues arrived, secure storage for military equipment and treasure, and potentially transport services, moving resources to campaign theatres. The documentary evidence for these services appears in governmental records, documenting transactions conducted through the temple and payments to Templar officials. The order's continued utility for royal military operations provided some protection against more aggressive challenges to their privileges, as Edward recognized the practical value of maintaining workable relationships with an organization possessing capabilities useful for his military ambitions. The fall of Acre in 1291, marking the final collapse of the Crusader states' territorial presence in the Holy Land, represented a catastrophic failure of the crusading movement and raised fundamental questions about the continuing purpose of military religious orders, whose original mission had been defending Christian control over Jerusalem, surrounding regions. The loss of the last major stronghold in the Levant forced the Templars and Hospitallers to relocate their headquarters to Cyprus, while contemplating various proposals for recovering the Holy Land, or identifying alternative missions that might justify their continued existence and extensive privileges. The English Templars, geographically distant from these strategic discussions and primarily focused on managing their economic operations, continued their established activities, while the order's international leadership struggled to develop convincing responses to critics, questioning whether military religious orders retained legitimate purposes after the loss of their original operational theatre. The criticisms directed against the Templars during the late 13th century, while never coalescing into systematic opposition before the dramatic events of the early 14th century, reflected various grievances and changing attitudes that would later contribute to the order's vulnerability. The satirical literature of the period occasionally portrayed Templars as proud, wealthy, and more concerned with their European estates than with fighting for the Holy Land, though these literary attacks represented elite cultural productions rather than necessarily reflecting widespread popular sentiment. The specific complaints directed against the order included objections to their claims of extensive legal privileges, their resistance to episcopal oversight, their alleged arrogance in dealing with other ecclesiastical institutions, and questions about whether their accumulated wealth was being effectively deployed for crusading purposes. The documentary evidence for these criticisms appears scattered through various sources, including episcopal registers, recording conflicts with Templar houses, chronicle passages expressing skepticism about the order's current activities, and occasional theological discussions questioning the legitimacy of military religious orders' exemptions from normal ecclesiastical discipline. The relationship between the Templars and other religious orders in England involved complex mixtures of cooperation, competition, and occasional conflict shaped by overlapping jurisdictions and competing claims to resources and privileges. The Hospitallers, as the Templars' principal rival military religious order, maintained generally cordial official relations, while competing for donations, recruits, and royal patronage. The two orders occasionally cooperated on crusading projects or diplomatic initiatives affecting both organizations' interests, while their similar institutional structures and parallel economic activities created situations where specific properties or rights generated disputes. The Cistercians, whose agricultural operations and commercial activities often paralleled Templar enterprises, represented another important institutional relationship, characterized by both practical cooperation and occasional tensions over property boundaries, water rights, and grazing lands. The documentary evidence for these intermonastic relationships appears primarily in disputes requiring ecclesiastical or royal intervention, potentially overemphasizing conflicts while underrepresenting routine cooperation and generally peaceful coexistence. The papal protection that had provided crucial support for Templar privileges and autonomy throughout the order's existence depended on maintaining good relationships with successive popes and ensuring that papal officials viewed the Templars as deserving continued support. The extensive corpus of papal bulls and letters addressing Templar affairs, issued by numerous popes throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, demonstrates both the order's success in cultivating papal favor and the papacy's general willingness to protect military religious orders dedicated to crusading service. The specific privileges granted through these papal documents included exemption from episcopal jurisdiction, permission to have their own chaplains and conduct religious services, even in areas under interdict, protection against arbitrary seizure of properties, and various other immunities that distinguish the Templars from ordinary religious houses. The maintenance of these privileges required ongoing diplomatic efforts at the papal curia, with the order maintaining representatives who could present Templar interests and respond to challenges from those seeking to limit or revoke particular exemptions. The election of Pope Boniface VIII in 1294 coincided with intensifying conflicts between the papacy and secular rulers, particularly King Philip IV of France, over questions of papal authority, royal taxation of church property, and the proper boundaries between spiritual and temporal jurisdictions. Boniface's aggressive assertions of papal supremacy and his conflicts with Philip over French royal taxation of French ecclesiastical properties created political tensions affecting all religious institutions whose operations crossed the boundaries between papal and royal authority. The Templars' international structure, with substantial properties in France and their headquarters located in territories where French influence could be exerted, made them potentially vulnerable to pressure from a French crown seeking to expand its authority and revenues. The theoretical papal protection that should have shielded the Templars from arbitrary royal action became less reliable as conflicts between Boniface and Philip escalated into open confrontation, culminating in the humiliation of Boniface at Anagni in 1303 and his death shortly thereafter. The succession of Benedict XI for the brief period from 1303 to 1304 provided insufficient time for any significant reorientation of papal policy. Before the election of Clement V in 1305, placed a French pope on the throne of St. Peter. Clement, formerly Bertrand de Got, Archbishop of Bordeaux, possessed complex loyalties as both a French ecclesiastic and a landholder in Gascony who technically owed fealty to the English crown. His decision to establish the papal court at Avignon rather than Rome, while officially temporary, effectively placed the papacy under French influence and enabled Philip IV to exercise unprecedented pressure on papal policy. The Templars' traditional reliance on papal support for maintaining their privileges and resisting secular interference became increasingly problematic, as Clement's pontificate demonstrated growing French influence over papal decision-making. The stage was being set for the dramatic events that would begin in October 1307, though few contemporaries could have anticipated the comprehensive assault on the entire Templar order that Philip IV was preparing. The administrative and economic operations of the English Templars during the final decades of the 13th century and opening years of the 14th century continued following established patterns, while the international political situation that would lead to the order's destruction developed largely beyond their awareness or control. The daily routines in English Templar preceptories combined religious observances, agricultural management, administrative duties, and maintenance of the military capabilities that theoretically remained central to the order's identity despite the loss of the Crusader states. The economic prosperity generated by the order's diverse income sources, including agricultural rents, wool sales, urban property revenues, and financial services, had created a wealthy institution whose assets would eventually prove vulnerable to seizure by a crown seeking to solve its financial problems through confiscation. The documentary evidence from this period reveals normal administrative activities, property transactions, and economic operations, showing no awareness that the order's entire existence would soon be threatened by accusations and political machinations that would destroy centuries of institutional development. The arrest of the French Templars on the 13th of October 1307, initiated by Philip IV's government with dramatic simultaneity across France, created shock and confusion throughout Christendom as news of the accusations spread. The charges against the order, claiming systematic heretical practices, including denial of Christ during admission ceremonies, spitting on the cross, worship of an idol called Baphomet, and various acts of sexual immorality, represented extraordinarily serious accusations that, if true, would justify not merely suppression of the order, but severe punishment of its members. The French government's use of torture to extract confessions from arrested Templars, applied systematically and with apparent coordination from central authority, produced testimony that appeared to confirm the accusations, though modern historians generally recognize these confessions as unreliable products of coercion. The political and financial motivations underlying Philip IV's assault on the Templars, including the French crown's substantial debts to the order and Philip's desire to seize Templar wealth, suggest that the accusations served primarily as pretexts for actions driven by practical considerations rather than genuine religious concerns. The news of the French arrests and accusations reached England during late 1307, creating difficult situations for both the English Templars and King Edward II, who had recently succeeded to the throne following his father's death in July 1307. Edward's initial response demonstrated skepticism about the charges, with letters to other European monarchs expressing doubt about the accusations and suggesting that reports from France might be exaggerated or motivated by desire for Templar wealth. This initial resistance to proceeding against the order reflected both Edward's judgment about the credibility of the accusations and his recognition that the English Templars had served the crown faithfully for nearly 2 centuries, without generating the kind of suspicions that might make such charges plausible. The political circumstances of Edward's early reign, including continuing military operations in Scotland and various domestic challenges, made him reluctant to initiate controversial proceedings against an established institution without compelling evidence of wrongdoing. The diplomatic pressure applied by both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV gradually overcame Edward's resistance to taking action against the English Templars. Clement's bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, issued in November 1307, ordered all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars in their territories and seize their properties, pending investigation of the accusations, transforming what had been a French matter into an international crisis affecting the entire order. This papal command placed Edward in a difficult position, where refusing to comply with explicit papal orders could be interpreted as protecting heretics and damaging his relationships with the papacy. The king's eventual decision to order the arrest of English Templars in January 1308 represented reluctant compliance with papal authority rather than enthusiastic support for the prosecution. Though once committed to the process, the English government implemented the arrests with characteristic administrative efficiency. The actual arrest of the English Templars proceeded on the 10th of January 1308, with royal officials simultaneously seizing Templar properties throughout the kingdom and taking custody of the order's members. The surviving documentation for these arrests, including writs to sheriffs ordering the seizure, inventories of Templar properties, and various administrative records tracking the imprisonment and interrogation of arrested brothers, provides detailed information about the English Templar community at the moment of its destruction. The total number of Templars arrested in England appears to have been between 150 and 200 individuals, including both knight brothers and sergeant brothers, distributed across the order's various preceptories and smaller establishments. This relatively modest size, compared to the several thousand members arrested in France, reflected England's peripheral position within the order's international structure and the order's strategy of maintaining many small communities, rather than concentrating large numbers of members at a few major centres. The interrogation of arrested Templars, conducted according to inquisitorial procedures established for heresy investigations, initially failed to produce the dramatic confessions that had emerged from French proceedings, where torture had been systematically employed from the outset. The ecclesiastical authorities appointed to examine the English Templars, including bishops and papal inquisitors, found that the accused brothers consistently denied the charges and maintained the orthodoxy of their beliefs and practices. This resistance created significant problems for prosecutors, as conviction for heresy under ecclesiastical law generally required either clear material evidence of heretical activities or confessions from the accused. The English legal traditions that prohibited torture in ordinary criminal proceedings, combined with ecclesiastical procedures that theoretically restricted torture to specific carefully regulated circumstances, meant that the initial interrogations conducted without coercive methods produced testimony favourable to the Templars, rather than incriminating confessions. The prolonged imprisonment of the English Templars in various locations throughout the kingdom, including royal castles, ecclesiastical facilities, and other secure locations, created harsh conditions even without formal torture. The documentary evidence describing imprisonment conditions reveals that Templars were held in chains, provided with minimal sustenance, and subjected to psychological pressure designed to break their resistance to confessing. The separation of imprisoned brothers from each other prevented coordination of their testimony, while isolation and uncertainty about their fate created mental stress, compounding the physical hardships of imprisonment. The financial burden of maintaining imprisoned Templars fell initially on the properties seized from the order, with detailed accounts tracking expenses for guards, food, and other costs associated with their custody. The impasse in the English proceedings, with imprisoned Templars refusing to confess despite months of harsh imprisonment, led to increasing pressure from papal officials and the French crown for authorization of torture. Pope Clement V's bull Faciens Misericordiam, issued in August 1308, explicitly authorized the use of torture in Templar investigations and established procedures for provincial church councils to examine evidence and render judgments. This papal authorization represented a significant escalation that demonstrated Clement's determination to proceed with suppression of the order, despite the absence of convincing evidence from regions outside France. The implementation of torture in the English investigation, though apparently less systematic and severe than the French procedures, eventually produced some confessions from English Templars, who succumbed to combinations of prolonged imprisonment, psychological pressure, and physical coercion. The confessions, extracted from English Templars under these coercive conditions, generally proved less elaborate and comprehensive than those obtained in France, with most English brothers admitting only to relatively minor irregularities during admission ceremonies. Some confessed to having been instructed to deny Christ or spit on crosses during their reception into the order, though they typically claimed to have refused or performed these acts only under duress and without sincere intent. These limited admissions, while technically confessing to heretical practices, lacked the detailed descriptions of idol worship, obscene rituals, and systematic moral corruption that characterized many French confessions. The relative moderation of English confessions, compared to the extreme testimony obtained in France, suggests either that torture applied to English Templars was less severe, or that English brothers possessed greater resistance to interrogation, possibly due to their genuine innocence of the more extreme charges. The Council of Vienne, convened by Pope Clement V in October 1311, represented the culmination of the proceedings against the Templars and the venue where their final fate would be determined. The council's agenda included various matters of church reform and crusading planning, alongside the Templar question, bringing together bishops and other ecclesiastical dignitaries from throughout Christendom. The evidence presented regarding Templar guilt derived primarily from the French proceedings, with the confessions obtained through torture forming the bulk of the incriminating material. The significant differences between French and English evidence, with English Templars having confessed to much less serious offences under much less systematic torture, created complications for arguments that the entire order was systematically corrupt. The political pressure from King Philip IV, who attended portions of the council with substantial military forces and made clear his determination to see the order suppressed, influenced the proceedings in ways that compromised their judicial character. The formal suppression of the Templar order, announced by Clement V in the Bull Vox in Excelso issued in March 1312, represented a carefully crafted compromise between judicial findings and political necessities. Rather than formally condemning the order as heretical, based on the evidence presented, which would have required clearer proof than the torture-extracted confessions provided, Clement suppressed the order through administrative papal authority. The bull's language emphasized the scandal and disrepute that had attached to the order, making its continuation impossible, regardless of questions about individual guilt or innocence. This formulation allowed suppression without requiring definitive proof of the systematic heresy that French accusations had alleged, while satisfying Philip IV's determination to eliminate the order and seize its properties. The transfer of Templar properties to the Hospitallers, specified in the bull Ad Providam, issued in May 1312, theoretically preserved these assets for crusading purposes, while denying them to secular rulers who might seek to confiscate them for their own use. The implementation of the suppression in England proceeded through a combination of ecclesiastical and royal authority, with detailed administrative procedures tracking the transfer of properties and the disposition of former Templars. The investigation of Templar properties, conducted by royal officials, produced extensive inventories, documenting the order's holdings throughout England, providing detailed information about the economic assets accumulated over nearly 2 centuries. These inventories recorded agricultural estates, urban properties, livestock, agricultural equipment, furnishings, religious objects, financial assets, and various other categories of property. The total value of English Templar holdings, while substantial, proved disappointing to those who had expected to find enormous treasure hoards, suggesting that most of the order's wealth consisted of productive properties rather than accumulated bullion or precious objects. The transfer of these properties to the Hospitallers occurred gradually over several years, with complex negotiations over debts, obligations, and the actual condition of transferred properties, creating ongoing administrative complications. The fate of individual English Templars following suppression of the order varied depending on their specific circumstances during the investigation and the confessions they had made under interrogation. Those who had confessed to heretical practices and submitted to the Church's authority generally received penances and were assigned to monastic houses where they would live under religious discipline for the remainder of their lives. The brothers who had maintained their innocence and refused to confess faced more uncertain prospects, as their obstinacy could be interpreted as impenitent heresy, deserving harsher punishment. However, the English ecclesiastical authorities generally proved reluctant to impose the death penalty that convicted heretics theoretically deserved, with no English Templars being executed despite the burning of numerous French Templars who had retracted their confessions or persisted in denying guilt. The documentary evidence tracking individual Templars after 1312 remains fragmentary, though surviving records indicate that most former English Templars spent their final years in various monastic houses, receiving modest pensions from the properties that had been transferred to the Hospitallers. The financial settlement regarding pensions for former Templars required negotiations between the Hospitallers, who had acquired the properties theoretically responsible for supporting these payments, and the ecclesiastical and royal authorities overseeing the suppression process. The amounts assigned to individual former Templars varied based on their rank within the order and their specific circumstances, with Knight brothers generally receiving larger pensions than sergeant brothers. The actual payment of these pensions proved problematic, as the Hospitallers argued that the properties transferred to them carried substantial debts and obligations that reduced their actual value below the nominal assessments used to calculate pension requirements. The documentary evidence reveals ongoing disputes about pension payments, extending for years after the formal suppression, with former Templars complaining about delayed or inadequate payments, while the Hospitallers protested the unreasonable financial burdens placed upon them. The historical assessment of the Templar suppression and the accusations that justified it has evolved considerably as scholarly investigation has examined the documentary evidence with critical methods unavailable to or unused by earlier historians. The consensus among modern scholars holds that the charges of systematic heresy were largely fabricated or extracted through torture, serving as pretexts for Philip IV's politically and financially motivated assault on the order. The specific accusations regarding denial of Christ, spitting on crosses, idol worship, and sexual immorality appear to have been either complete inventions or extreme exaggerations of relatively minor irregularities in admission ceremonies. The theological and practical implausibility of the charges, combined with the lack of credible evidence, independent of torture-extracted confessions, supports the conclusion that the Templars were victims of judicial persecution, rather than guilty of the crimes alleged against them. The question of whether any kernel of truth underlay the accusations, particularly regarding unusual admission ceremonies, remains subject to scholarly debate. Some historians have suggested that Templar admission rituals might have included symbolic tests of obedience involving commands to deny Christ or spit on crosses, with candidates expected to refuse these commands as demonstrations of their faith. Such practices, if they existed, might have been misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented by hostile interrogators seeking to construct heresy charges. However, the evidence for even these modified versions of the accusations remains weak, consisting primarily of confessions extracted under conditions that make them unreliable. The alternative explanation, that the accusations were entirely fabricated based on stereotypical heresy charges applied to various groups throughout medieval history, appears more consistent with the available evidence and the political context of the suppression. The financial outcomes of the Templar suppression in England reveal complex patterns of property transfer and asset distribution that benefited various parties despite the theoretical preservation of Templar wealth for crusading purposes. Through transfer to the Hospitallers, the English crown retained certain properties and financial assets through various mechanisms, including claims for debts allegedly owed by the Templars and retention of properties during the extended transition period. The administrative costs associated with imprisoning Templars, conducting investigations, and managing properties during the suppression process consumed substantial resources that reduced the net value transferred to the Hospitallers. Individual royal officials and others involved in the suppression proceedings found opportunities for personal enrichment through embezzlement and various forms of corruption that characterized much medieval administration. The Hospitallers' acquisition of Templar properties, while theoretically advantageous for expanding their resources, created practical challenges, including assumption of existing debts and obligations, integration of properties into their existing administrative structures, and management of the political complications arising from their role as beneficiaries of the suppression. The documentary evidence reveals that many former Templar properties proved less valuable than initial assessments suggested, due to accumulated debts, deteriorated conditions resulting from neglect during the suppression proceedings, and various legal complications affecting clear title. The Hospitallers' financial situation, rather than being dramatically improved by the Templar properties, actually involved substantial administrative and financial burdens that took years to resolve. The theoretical benefit of eliminating their principal institutional rival was offset by practical difficulties in managing the expanded properties and the political complications of being seen as beneficiaries of a controversial suppression. The impact of the Templar suppression on English society extended beyond the immediate effects on former Templar members and their properties to influence broader attitudes toward military religious orders, papal authority, and the relationship between spiritual and temporal power. The demonstration that even a powerful international religious order enjoying extensive papal privileges could be destroyed through coordinated action by a determined secular ruler and a compliant pope undermined confidence in institutional protections and legal immunities. The use of heresy charges as pretexts for politically motivated prosecutions established precedents that would influence subsequent conflicts between secular and ecclesiastical authorities. The failure of the crusading movement's institutional structures, symbolized by both the loss of the Holy Land and the suppression of the order most closely identified with crusading ideals, contributed to declining enthusiasm for crusading projects and growing skepticism about whether military expeditions to recover Jerusalem remained feasible or desirable. The physical remains of Templar presence in England, including architectural fragments, archaeological sites, and various material culture objects, provide tangible evidence for the order's activities and integration into English medieval society. The Temple Church in London, surviving as an active place of worship, despite severe damage during World War II bombing and subsequent restoration, represents the most visible and accessible Templar monument in England. The church's distinctive round nave and the collection of medieval tomb effigies, including William Marshall's monument, attract visitors interested in medieval history while serving continuing religious functions. The archaeological investigation of the church and surrounding temple precinct has revealed evidence for various structures and activities, though subsequent development has destroyed or obscured much of the medieval complex. The archaeological remains at former Templar preceptories throughout England vary considerably in their preservation and accessibility, ranging from substantial architectural fragments to completely destroyed sites where only documentary evidence indicates former Templar presence. The sites where medieval buildings survive, even in fragmentary or heavily modified form, provide valuable information about Templar architectural practices and the physical infrastructure supporting their religious and economic activities. The investigation of these sites using modern archaeological methods, including geophysical survey, systematic excavation, and scientific analysis of artifacts and environmental remains, has expanded understanding of daily life in Templar communities beyond what documentary sources alone could reveal. The material culture recovered from Templar sites, including ceramics, metalwork, animal bones, plant remains, and various other artifact categories, demonstrates the order's participation in broader patterns of medieval English material culture, while occasionally revealing distinctive practices or objects related to their specific institutional character. The place names and field names preserving memory of former Templar ownership provide widespread evidence for the order's geographical distribution and the persistence of their memory in local landscapes long after the suppression. The frequent occurrence of Temple in English place names, appearing in forms such as Temple Newsome, Temple Brewer, Temple Grafton, and numerous other variants, marks locations of former Templar properties. The study of these toponyms, combined with documentary research and field survey, enables reconstruction of the spatial organization of Templar estates and their integration into local settlement patterns. The survival of these names for over 7 centuries after the suppression testifies to the significance of Templar presence in local memory and the importance of their properties within medieval landscapes. The scholarly investigation of the Templars' English history has developed through several distinct phases, reflecting changing historical methods, available sources, and scholarly interests. The early antiquarian studies of the 17th and 18th centuries, conducted by scholars with limited access to medieval documentary sources and influenced by various myths and legends surrounding the order, produced accounts mixing accurate observations with fanciful speculation. The professionalization of historical scholarship during the 19th century and the systematic publication of medieval governmental records enabled more rigorous investigation based on contemporary documentary evidence. The 20th century development of specialized medieval studies, including economic history, social history, and the history of religious institutions, provided analytical frameworks for understanding the Templars within broader patterns of medieval social and economic development. The recent scholarly emphasis on the Templars' economic activities, particularly their involvement in agricultural production, commercial trade, and financial operations, has revealed the sophisticated business practices underlying their religious mission. The detailed analysis of surviving accounts, manorial surveys, and commercial documents has demonstrated that Templar economic management compared favorably with other successful monastic landlords and commercial enterprises of the medieval period. This economic efficiency, while sometimes criticized by contemporaries as excessive worldliness, actually enabled the order to generate the substantial resources necessary for supporting military operations in the Crusader states, while maintaining their European establishments. The integration of the Templars into commercial networks, urban economies, and royal financial administration reveals their thorough involvement in the economic transformations characterizing the 12th and 13th centuries. The popular cultural legacy of the Knights Templar, distinct from scholarly historical understanding, has generated extensive mythological elaborations and conspiracy theories with minimal connection to documented historical realities. The various legends associating the Templars with the Holy Grail, hidden treasures, secret knowledge, and survival, as clandestine organizations, bear no relationship to historical evidence and reflect romantic imagination rather than medieval realities. The proliferation of these myths through popular literature, films, and various fringe theories has created widespread public conceptions of the Templars that contradict scholarly consensus about the order's actual history and character. The persistence of these mythological narratives, despite scholarly debunking, reflects the Templars' continuing appeal as symbols of medieval mystery and the human tendency to create elaborate alternative histories around groups whose dramatic rise and fall invite speculation. The scholarly responsibility for distinguishing documented history from mythological elaboration requires constant reiteration of the evidentiary foundations for historical claims about the Templars, while acknowledging the limitations of surviving sources. The documentary record, while extensive compared to many medieval institutions, remains fragmentary and biased toward particular types of information, especially administrative and legal matters. The aspects of Templar life that left limited documentary traces, including daily religious practices, personal relationships among members, and internal discussions about policy and strategy, must be reconstructed through careful inference from surviving evidence rather than direct observation. The honest acknowledgement of these evidentiary limitations, combined with rigorous, critical evaluation of available sources, provides the foundation for credible historical understanding that resists both uncritical acceptance of medieval propaganda and romantic elaboration of fragmentary evidence. The regional variations in Templar presence and activities throughout England reflected geographical differences in economic opportunities, patterns of aristocratic patronage, and strategic considerations affecting property acquisition. The concentration of Templar holdings in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire resulted from early donations by northern aristocratic families and the suitability of these regions for the pastoral agriculture that became increasingly important to Templar economic operations. The specific properties acquired in these regions included both arable lands suitable for grain cultivation and extensive pastures, supporting the sheep flocks that produced wool for commercial markets. The development of preceptories at locations such as Temple Newsam in Yorkshire created administrative centres, managing multiple subordinate properties, while providing residence for Templar communities, maintaining the order's religious and military character. The Templar presence in London, while numerically small in terms of resident brothers, exercised disproportionate influence due to the capital's political and economic importance. The new temple's position between the City of London and Westminster placed the order at the intersection of commercial and governmental activities, facilitating their financial services to both royal government and private clients. The development of the temple precinct into a complex including not only religious buildings and residential quarters, but also commercial properties, administrative offices, and secure storage facilities, demonstrated the order's adaptation to urban opportunities. The social connections between leading Templars and the urban elite, including merchants, royal officials, and aristocrats maintaining London residences, integrated the order into networks of power and influence, extending beyond their strictly religious functions. The Templar holdings in southern and southwestern England, including properties in counties such as Somerset, Gloucestershire, and Kent, complemented the northern estates, while providing access to different economic opportunities and commercial networks. The specific properties in these regions included agricultural estates, urban holdings, and various commercial facilities, including mills and fisheries. The management of these geographically dispersed properties required effective administrative systems, coordinating activities across hundreds of miles while maintaining sufficient oversight to prevent mismanagement or embezzlement. The documentary evidence for this administrative coordination appears in surviving accounts and correspondence, demonstrating regular communication between preceptories and periodic inspections by senior officials, verifying proper management and compliance with the order's regulations. The smaller Templar establishments scattered throughout England, including individual manors or farms attached to larger preceptories, extended the order's presence into local communities, where direct Templar involvement might be limited to occasional visits by officials collecting revenues or supervising operations. These properties, worked by tenant farmers or hired labourers rather than Templar brothers, generated revenues supporting the order's activities while requiring minimal permanent Templar presence. The integration of these properties into local economies and social structures created connections between the international religious order and English rural communities, though the nature and depth of these connections varied considerably depending on local circumstances. The documentary evidence for tenant relationships, labour services, and various obligations owed to Templar landlords reveals patterns generally similar to those characterising other ecclesiastical and secular estates, suggesting that Templar lordship, while theoretically distinctive due to the order's religious character, operated according to conventional medieval economic relationships in most practical matters. The Templars' interactions with Jewish communities in medieval England, though poorly documented in surviving sources, necessarily occurred through the commercial and financial networks where both groups operated. The concentration of both Templars and Jews in London and other urban centres created geographical proximity, even if social and religious barriers limited direct personal interaction. The economic functions performed by Jewish moneylenders, providing credit services that canonical restrictions theoretically prevented Christians from offering, potentially created both competitive and complementary relationships with the Templars' own financial operations. The specific nature of these economic relationships remains largely invisible in surviving documentation, though the broader context of Christian-Jewish relations in medieval England suggests that whatever interactions occurred took place within frameworks of legal inequality and religious separation. The impact of the Templar presence on the English economy, while difficult to quantify precisely due to limitations of medieval economic data, clearly represented significant contributions to agricultural development, commercial expansion, and financial innovation. The Order's investments in agricultural infrastructure, including land clearance, drainage improvements, and construction of processing facilities, increased productivity and contributed to the broader agricultural expansion characterizing the 12th and 13th centuries. The Templar involvement in wool production positioned them as significant participants in England's most valuable export trade, connecting English pastoral agriculture with continental textile manufacturing through commercial networks spanning Western Europe. The financial services provided by the Templars, particularly their custody of royal treasure and provision of credit to the crown, played essential roles in enabling the expanding scope and sophistication of royal governance during this period of state formation and administrative development. The military contributions of English Templars to crusading efforts, while never constituting England's primary participation in crusading campaigns, represented the Order's most direct connection to their original mission of defending Christian control over the Holy Land. The periodic dispatch of English Templar brothers to serve in the Crusader states provided the Order's eastern operations with personnel possessing military training and experience, while demonstrating that English resources actively supported the defense of Jerusalem and other holy sites. The specific numbers of English Templars serving in the East at any given time remains unknown due to gaps in surviving records, though the relatively small size of the English Templar community suggests that Eastern service probably involved dozens rather than hundreds of brothers at any particular moment. The financial support provided by English Templar properties, converted through the Order's international networks into supplies, equipment, and money usable in the Eastern Mediterranean, probably represented more significant contributions than the limited numbers of English personnel serving there. The reputation of the Templar Order for military discipline and effectiveness, established through their performance in numerous battles and sieges throughout the Crusader state's existence, reflected organizational principles and tactical doctrines developed through painful experience with warfare against capable Muslim opponents. The emphasis on coordinated unit action rather than individual heroics, the strict prohibition against unauthorized engagement with enemies, and the elaborate command structures governing tactical decisions created military forces that contemporaries recognized as exceptionally reliable and effective, despite their relatively modest numbers. The specific tactical methods employed by Templar units, including their role as heavy cavalry in coordinated charges, their garrison duties in isolated frontier fortresses, and their participation in complex siege operations, demonstrated versatility, extending beyond simple battlefield combat to encompass the full range of military operations required for defending and expanding Crusader territories. The military setbacks suffered by the Templars during various campaigns, including the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, where much of the Order's eastern leadership was killed or captured, demonstrated that military effectiveness could not always overcome strategic disadvantages or compensate for poor decisions by Crusader political and military leadership. The gradual erosion of Crusader territories through the 12th and 13th centuries, culminating in the loss of Acre in 1291, occurred despite the Templars' military capabilities and reflected broader strategic realities, including the superior resources available to unified Muslim powers, the difficulties of defending extended frontiers with limited manpower, and the declining flow of reinforcements and supplies from Western Europe. The Order's ultimate failure to preserve Christian control over the Holy Land, while not resulting from any lack of military prowess or dedication, nevertheless undermined arguments for continuing the extensive privileges and resources devoted to military religious orders, whose primary mission had become impossible to achieve. The religious life maintained in Templar preceptories throughout England, combining elements of monastic discipline with practical recognition of the Order's military character, and economic responsibilities, created hybrid institutions that contemporaries sometimes found difficult to categorize within conventional ecclesiastical frameworks. The daily round of religious services, private prayer, and participation in the liturgical cycle connected Templar communities to broader patterns of Christian devotion, while the military training, administrative duties, and agricultural labor that occupied much of their time created distinctive rhythms different from purely contemplative monasteries. The quality of religious observance probably varied considerably among different preceptories and individual members, with some Templars maintaining high standards of devotion, while others focused more on the practical aspects of military training or estate management. The absence of detailed contemporary descriptions of Templar religious life, compared to the extensive literature describing practices in other monastic orders, reflects both the order's emphasis on secrecy regarding internal affairs and the generally limited interest among medieval religious writers in documenting practices of military orders. The spiritual benefits associated with supporting the Templar order, including prayers offered for donors and their families, participation in the order's collective spiritual merit generated through their crusading service, and various indulgences granted by popes to Templar supporters, motivated much of the charitable giving that built the order's economic foundation. The theological framework, understanding these spiritual returns, conceptualized the Templars' military service as a form of martyrdom in defense of Christianity, making donations to the order particularly meritorious acts that generated exceptional spiritual rewards. The integration of this theology with practical economic relationships created systems where material donations produced both tangible returns in terms of social prestige and political connections, and intangible spiritual benefits that medieval Christians valued highly. The complex motivations underlying Templar patronage, combining piety, social ambition, political calculation, and genuine belief in the crusading cause, resist simple categorization, while revealing the multifaceted nature of medieval religious culture. The educational functions performed by Templar preceptories, though never their primary purpose, included training young aristocrats in military skills and chivalric culture, while potentially providing some instruction in literacy and administrative competence. The practice of placing young boys in Templar custody for education in arms and courtesy appears in various sources, suggesting that some aristocratic families viewed Templar establishments as appropriate venues for the military and social training necessary for knightly careers. The extent and nature of this educational activity remains unclear from surviving evidence, though the Templars' reputation for military discipline and their aristocratic connections made them plausible choices for families seeking appropriate training environments for their sons. The administrative expertise required for managing complex economic operations meant that at least some Templars possessed literacy and numeracy skills, though whether these capabilities were acquired before joining the order or developed through internal training programs cannot be determined from available sources. The Templars' participation in English political conflicts, while theoretically limited by their religious character and international obligations, necessarily involved them in various disputes and controversies affecting the kingdom during their nearly 2-century presence. The order's role as custodian of royal treasure and provider of financial services created situations where they possessed valuable information about royal resources and planning, making them potentially useful sources of intelligence for royal opponents. The careful political neutrality that senior Templars generally maintained during domestic conflicts reflected both institutional self-interest in avoiding identification with losing factions and genuine commitment to their international mission, requiring maintenance of good relations with legitimate authorities. The occasions when Templars were accused of favouring particular political factions or betraying confidences probably reflected either deliberate political attacks designed to undermine their credibility or genuine instances where individual Templars allowed personal connections to compromise their institutional neutrality. The ceremonial roles performed by the Temple Church in London, including its use for important political meetings, legal proceedings, and various state functions, demonstrated the order's integration into England's highest levels of governance and society. The church's location between the commercial city and governmental Westminster, combined with its status as a peculiar jurisdiction outside normal episcopal authority, made it attractive for various purposes requiring neutral territory or legal immunity from ordinary courts. The specific functions conducted at the temple included meetings of the Royal Council, sessions of royal courts when the king's government was in London, storage of important state documents, and various diplomatic negotiations requiring secure and private venues. The architectural grandeur and prestigious associations of the temple church enhanced the symbolic significance of ceremonies conducted there, while the order's military character added appropriate martial atmosphere to events involving knights and warriors. The social composition of the English Templar community, while predominantly aristocratic in leadership positions and among knight brothers, included significant numbers of members from less elevated social backgrounds, serving as sergeant brothers or in various non-combatant capacities. The knight brothers, required to possess appropriate noble status and demonstrate capability for heavy cavalry service, came from families ranging from the higher aristocracy to the lower gentry, with most probably from the middling levels of the warrior class. The sergeant brothers, performing both military functions as lighter cavalry or infantry and various administrative or craft roles, derived from somewhat lower social strata, though still generally from families with some property and social standing. The non-combatant brothers, including priests serving as chaplains and various specialists managing agricultural operations, financial accounts, or craft production, represented diverse backgrounds appropriate to their specific functions. The recruitment patterns for English Templars, insofar as they can be reconstructed from fragmentary evidence, suggest that family connections and regional networks played important roles in attracting new members. The phenomenon of multiple members of the same family joining the order, either simultaneously or across different generations, appears occasionally in documentary sources and suggests that Templar service became a tradition in certain families. The geographical clustering of recruits from particular regions, while partly reflecting the location of Templar properties where young men would encounter the order, also indicates that local reputation and social networks influence decisions to join. The motivations underlying individual decisions to become Templars probably varied considerably, including genuine religious vocation, attraction to the military aspects of the order's mission, family tradition or pressure, lack of attractive alternatives due to position as younger sons with limited inheritance prospects, and various combinations of these and other factors. The age structure of the English Templar community at the time of suppression, reconstructible from interrogation records that sometimes note individuals' ages or length of service, reveals a mature organization, including many members who had spent decades in the order, alongside more recent recruits. The presence of elderly members who had joined during the mid-13th century and served for 40 or 50 years indicates that the order successfully retained members throughout their lives, rather than experiencing high turnover. The existence of this experienced cadre of senior members provided institutional memory and continuity, while creating potential rigidity if long-serving members resisted adaptation to changing circumstances. The relatively small numbers of very young members at the time of suppression might reflect either declining recruitment in the order's final decades or the lengthy training period required before formal admission to full membership. The health and medical care available to Templars, following general medieval monastic patterns, included basic treatment for injuries and illnesses, conducted within preceptories by members possessing medical knowledge, with more serious cases potentially requiring specialized care from external physicians or confinement in monastic infirmaries. The rules provisions regarding care for sick brothers emphasize the community's responsibility to provide appropriate treatment and nursing while maintaining proper religious observances even during illness. The archaeological evidence for medical practices at Templar sites remains limited, though occasional finds of pharmaceutical vessels or surgical instruments suggest some level of medical capability. The specific health challenges facing Templars probably varied between those serving in the relatively benign English climate and brothers deployed to the Crusader states, where different disease environments and combat injuries created more severe medical challenges. The relationship between the Templars and the emerging urban middle classes in medieval English towns represented complex combinations of economic partnership, social distance, and occasional tension over jurisdictional boundaries and commercial competition. The Order's urban properties generated rental income from merchant and artisan tenants, while the Templars' own commercial activities, including buying and selling agricultural products and providing financial services, brought them into regular contact with urban commercial networks. The social distance between aristocratic Templar knights and bourgeois merchants, while maintained through various forms of social distinction and differential legal status, did not prevent practical economic cooperation where mutual benefits could be achieved. The specific nature of these urban relationships probably varied considerably depending on local circumstances, the personalities of individuals involved, and the particular economic opportunities or conflicts arising in different commercial contexts. The Templars' involvement in London's commercial life, while never their primary focus, positioned them as significant participants in various markets and trading networks operating in and through England's largest city. The Temple's location provided easy access to the commercial facilities of the City of London, while the Order's international connections enabled participation in long-distance trade, linking England with continental markets. The specific commercial activities conducted by or through the Temple probably included transactions in wool, cloth, wine, spices, and various other commodities moving through London's markets, though the fragmentary survival of commercial records prevents detailed reconstruction of the volume or character of these activities. The financial services provided by the Temple, including money changing, secure storage, and various credit arrangements, integrated the Order into London's emerging financial sector alongside Jewish and Christian moneylenders, Italian merchant bankers, and various other providers of specialized financial services. The cultural patronage exercised by the Templars, while modest compared to some other wealthy ecclesiastical institutions, included commissioning of religious art, maintenance of elaborate churches and chapels, and presumably some support for literary and musical activities appropriate to their religious character. The tomb effigies and architectural decorations surviving in the Temple Church represent high-quality medieval art, demonstrating the Order's access to skilled craftsmen and willingness to invest in prestigious monuments. The manuscript books required for religious services and potentially for administrative record-keeping would have required either purchase from commercial scriptoria or maintenance of in-house copying facilities, though the evidence for Templar book production remains limited. The musical requirements for conducting proper liturgical services presumably required training some members or employed chaplains in appropriate chant repertoires, though the specific nature of Templar musical culture remains largely undocumented. The legal disputes involving the Templars, documented in various royal and ecclesiastical court records, reveal the practical workings of the Order's jurisdictional privileges and the conflicts these exemptions could generate with other parties claiming competing rights. The cases recorded in these sources include disputes over property boundaries, disagreements about tithe payments, conflicts over jurisdictional authority, challenges to the validity of specific privileges, and various other legal controversies characteristic of medieval landholding and ecclesiastical administration. The outcomes of these disputes varied depending on the specific issues involved, the evidence presented, and the political circumstances affecting judicial decision-making. The general pattern suggests that the Templars successfully defended their core privileges, in most cases, while accepting some limitations on the most expansive interpretations of their rights. The impact of natural disasters and economic crises on Templar operations, including crop failures, livestock diseases, severe weather events, and market disruptions, created periodic challenges requiring adaptive responses from estate managers and administrators. The documentary evidence for these crises appears in occasional account entries, noting unusual expenses, reduced revenues, or specific problems requiring extraordinary measures. The agricultural diversity of Templar holdings, including both arable and pastoral farming across geographically dispersed properties, provided some protection against localized disasters, while the order's financial resources enabled short-term accommodation of revenue shortfalls. The broader economic disruptions affecting English society during particular periods, including the famines of the early 14th century and various commercial crises, would have affected Templar operations, along with other agricultural and commercial enterprises. The environmental impact of Templar agricultural operations, including land clearance, drainage projects, and intensive cultivation, contributed to the broader transformation of English landscapes during the medieval period. The conversion of woodland, marsh, and waste into productive agricultural land increased food production, while permanently altering ecosystems and hydrology. The specific environmental changes attributable to Templar activities cannot easily be distinguished from the broader patterns of agricultural expansion characterizing this period, though the order's documented investments in drainage and land improvement suggest they participated actively in these transformative processes. The long-term sustainability of medieval agricultural practices, including the Templars' operations, remains subject to debate among environmental historians, with some arguing that medieval farming created lasting ecological damage, while others contend that pre-modern agriculture generally maintained sustainable balances between exploitation and regeneration. The legacy of the Templars in English historical memory evolved through various phases, reflecting changing historical understanding, political contexts, and cultural interests. The immediate post-suppression period saw efforts to justify the order's destruction through repetition of the heresy charges and emphasis on the confessions extracted during interrogations. The gradual recognition that these accusations were politically motivated fabrications led to historical rehabilitation, portraying the Templars as innocent victims of royal greed and papal weakness. The romantic 19th century interest in medieval chivalry and crusading transformed the Templars into symbols of medieval virtue and military prowess, often with limited connection to historical realities. The modern scholarly understanding, based on critical analysis of documentary evidence and contextualization within broader medieval social and economic patterns, presents the Templars as a significant but ultimately conventional medieval institution whose dramatic suppression resulted from political circumstances rather than any genuine threat they posed to Christian orthodoxy. The architectural heritage of the Templars in England, though fragmentary due to centuries of destruction, modification, and development, provides tangible connections to the order's historical presence while creating ongoing responsibilities for preservation and interpretation. The Temple Church in London, as the most complete surviving Templar building, represents both an important medieval monument requiring careful conservation and an active place of worship, maintaining continuity with its original religious purposes. The conservation challenges include managing the effects of urban pollution, addressing structural deterioration from age and war damage, and balancing the needs of historical preservation with the requirements of an active congregation. The other surviving fragments of Templar architecture scattered throughout England, including portions of churches, domestic buildings, and agricultural structures at various former preceptory sites, require ongoing monitoring and preservation efforts to prevent further deterioration while enabling appropriate public access for educational purposes. The archaeological potential of former Templar sites, much of which remains unexplored due to later development or insufficient resources for systematic investigation, offers opportunities for expanding understanding of the Order's daily operations and material culture. The application of modern archaeological techniques, including geophysical survey, environmental sampling, and detailed artifact analysis, could reveal information about diet, health, agricultural practices, craft production, and various other aspects of Templar life that documentary sources address only indirectly or not at all. The integration of archaeological evidence with documentary research enables more comprehensive reconstruction of Templar society than either source type could provide independently, while highlighting the complementary strengths and limitations of different categories of historical evidence. The comparative study of the English Templars, within broader contexts of the order's international operations, other military religious orders' development, and general patterns of medieval ecclesiastical and economic history provides frameworks for assessing their distinctive characteristics and typical features. The comparison with Templar communities in France, Spain, the Holy Land, and other regions reveals both common organizational patterns deriving from the order's centralized structure and international rule, and regional variations reflecting different political circumstances, economic opportunities, and cultural contexts. The parallel development of the Hospitallers in England, following similar trajectories of property accumulation and institutional growth, while maintaining different emphases in their religious and charitable activities, demonstrates how military religious orders adapted common institutional models to their specific missions and circumstances. The enduring fascination with the Knights Templar in popular culture, academic scholarship, and various forms of historical memory reflects the dramatic arc of their history. From humble origins through spectacular success to catastrophic suppression, the order's combination of religious devotion with military prowess, their accumulation of substantial wealth while maintaining theoretical commitment to poverty, their international character transcending national boundaries, and their sudden destruction on controversial charges, creates a narrative with inherent dramatic appeal. The responsible presentation of Templar history requires distinguishing documented historical realities from later mythological elaborations, while acknowledging the legitimate areas of uncertainty where limited evidence prevents definitive conclusions. The scholarly obligation to present accurate historical understanding while recognizing the cultural significance of Templar memory in various non-scholarly contexts creates ongoing challenges for historians seeking to communicate effectively with diverse audiences possessing different interests and expectations. The Knights Templars' presence in England from the late 1120s until their suppression in 1312 represented a significant chapter in both English medieval history and the broader development of military religious institutions serving the crusading movement. Their economic operations contributed to agricultural development, commercial expansion, and financial innovation, while their political connections positioned them as essential components of royal governmental machinery. Their religious identity connected English society to international crusading efforts and broader patterns of reformed monasticism characterizing the Central Middle Ages. Their ultimate suppression, resulting more from political machinations than genuine religious deviance, demonstrated the vulnerability of even powerful, privileged institutions when determined secular rulers and compliant popes coordinated attacks on their legitimacy. The surviving evidence documenting their activities, preserved in governmental records, ecclesiastical registers, architectural remains, and archaeological deposits, enables modern understanding of their complex roles within English medieval society, while illustrating broader patterns of institutional development, economic change, and political conflict that shaped the medieval world. The immediate aftermath of the Templar suppression in England witnessed the gradual dispersal of former members into various monastic houses throughout the kingdom, creating scattered communities of men whose institutional identity had been destroyed but whose individual lives continued under altered circumstances. The assignment of former Templars to Augustinian, Benedictine, and Cistercian houses reflected both practical considerations about available accommodation and ecclesiastical judgments about appropriate supervision for men who had confessed to varying degrees of religious error. The pension arrangements negotiated between the Hospitallers and ecclesiastical authorities established financial obligations that would persist for decades as former Templars aged and died in their assigned monasteries. The documentary evidence tracking these individuals through their final years appears sporadically in monastic account books and episcopal registers, recording pension payments, deaths, and occasional disputes about the adequacy of support provided. The physical properties transferred from the Templars to the Hospitallers underwent various transformations, reflecting both the new owners' different institutional priorities and the practical challenges of integrating geographically dispersed estates into existing administrative structures. The conversion of former Templar preceptories into hospitaller commanderies involved architectural modifications, changes in agricultural management strategies, and reorientation of economic activities towards supporting the Hospitallers' naval operations based in Rhodes, rather than the Templars' former crusading activities in the Holy Land. The archaeological evidence for this transitional period remains limited, though occasional documentary references and architectural analysis of surviving structures reveal some patterns of continuity and change. The retention of Templar churches and chapels for continuing religious use preserved some architectural elements, while other buildings were demolished, substantially modified, or left to deteriorate when their functions became obsolete. The gradual fading of living memory regarding the Templars' actual operations and character, as the generation that had known them personally died during the 14th century, created conditions where their history could be reinterpreted according to changing cultural needs and political circumstances. The immediate post-suppression emphasis on the heresy charges and the confessions obtained during interrogations served the interests of those who had orchestrated or supported the suppression, providing justification for actions that had destroyed a powerful institution and redistributed its wealth. However, the growing recognition among informed observers that the accusations had been politically motivated and the confessions unreliable began shifting interpretations toward viewing the Templars as victims of injustice rather than dangerous heretics deserving their fate. The scholarly investigation of Templar history during the 15th and 16th centuries, conducted primarily by ecclesiastical historians with access to archival materials, produced more nuanced assessments based on examination of documentary evidence rather than acceptance of suppression-era propaganda. The humanist historical methods developing during the Renaissance encouraged critical evaluation of sources and recognition that political motivations could produce biased or fabricated accounts. The specific reassessments of the Templar case, appearing in various historical works during this period, generally concluded that the order had been unjustly suppressed through combinations of royal greed and papal weakness, though these scholarly revisions reached limited audiences compared to the popular legends that were simultaneously developing through oral tradition and literary elaboration. The emergence of romantic narratives about the Templars during the late medieval and early modern periods reflected broader cultural patterns of nostalgia for imagined medieval virtue and the transformation of historical institutions into symbols serving contemporary cultural needs. The literary treatments of Templar themes, appearing in various forms, including chronicles, romances, and eventually printed books, emphasize dramatic elements, including secret knowledge, hidden treasures, and survival of the order through clandestine continuation. These narrative developments bore increasingly tenuous connections to documented historical realities, as successive retellings elaborated and transformed the stories according to the expectations of different audiences and the conventions of different literary genres. The Reformation conflicts of the 16th century created new contexts for invoking Templar history, as Protestant and Catholic polemicists sought historical precedents supporting their competing positions regarding papal authority, ecclesiastical corruption, and the proper relationship between spiritual and temporal power. The suppression of the Templars could be interpreted as demonstrating either the dangers of unchecked papal power or the corruption of the medieval church, depending on which side of the confessional divide one occupied. These theological appropriations of Templar history cared little for historical accuracy, instead using the order's dramatic rise and fall as rhetorical weapons in contemporary religious controversies. The antiquarian investigations of the 17th and 18th centuries, driven by emerging interests in national history and the physical remains of the medieval past, produced the first systematic attempts to document surviving Templar architecture and to catalogue documentary evidence for the order's English operations. The antiquarian scholars, including William Dugdale, whose Monasticon Anglicanum compiled extensive information about English monastic institutions, gathered and published materials that would provide foundations for later historical research. These antiquarian compilations, while lacking the critical source analysis that would characterize later professional historiography, preserved valuable information and stimulated broader interest in medieval history among educated audiences. The antiquarians' focus on architectural remains and their production of detailed descriptions and illustrations of Templar buildings created records of structures that would subsequently be destroyed or substantially modified, providing modern scholars with evidence that would otherwise be completely lost. The 18th century emergence of Freemasonry in England and Scotland created entirely new contexts for appropriating Templar symbolism and history. As fraternal organizations seeking historical legitimacy and romantic appeal constructed elaborate mythological genealogies, connecting themselves to medieval institutions. The development of Templar degrees within certain Masonic rites during the mid-18th century involved creating initiation ceremonies, regalia, and origin narratives claiming direct institutional descent from the suppressed order. These Masonic appropriations bore no historical connection to the actual medieval Templars, instead representing creative inventions serving the social and cultural needs of 18th century fraternal organizations. The specific mechanisms by which Masonic lodges supposedly preserved Templar traditions involved fantastic narratives about escaping knights, carrying secret knowledge to Scotland, clandestine continuation through centuries of persecution, and eventual revival within Masonic structures. The development of these Masonic Templar myths reflected broader Enlightenment-era interests in ancient wisdom traditions, secret societies, and the recovery of supposedly lost knowledge from earlier civilizations. The cultural context of 18th century esotericism, including interests in alchemy, Rosicrucianism, and various forms of mystical philosophy, created receptive audiences for narratives claiming to preserve ancient secrets through initiatory traditions. The Templars' historical reputation for secrecy regarding their internal practices, combined with the dramatic circumstances of their suppression, made them attractive subjects for mythological elaboration by groups seeking prestigious historical pedigrees and mysterious origins. The scholarly response to these Masonic appropriations varied from outright dismissal to attempts at serious investigation of whether any historical connections might exist between medieval Templars and early modern fraternal organizations. The absence of any documentary evidence supporting institutional continuity, combined with the demonstrable invention of key elements in the Masonic narratives, led most serious historians to reject claims of genuine descent. However, the popular appeal of these origin stories and their integration into Masonic ritual practice ensured their persistence regardless of scholarly debunking, creating parallel traditions of historical scholarship and mythological elaboration that addressed different audiences and served different cultural functions. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries generated new forms of interest in medieval history that emphasized emotional engagement, aesthetic appreciation, and imaginative reconstruction rather than strict adherence to documentary evidence. The Romantic fascination with medieval chivalry, crusading, and monastic life produced literary works, paintings, and architectural revivals that transformed the Middle Ages into a realm of heroic adventure and spiritual authenticity, contrasting favorably with the perceived materialism and rationalism of industrial society. The Templars' combination of religious devotion with military prowess, their international character, and their tragic destruction made them ideal subjects for romantic treatment in various artistic media. The literary representations of Templars in Romantic-era works, including Sir Walter Scott's novels, demonstrated both the creative possibilities and historical distortions that resulted from prioritizing dramatic narrative over documentary accuracy. Scott's portrayal of Templars in works such as Ivanhoe, while based on general historical knowledge, created fictional characters and situations, serving novelistic requirements, rather than attempting faithful historical reconstruction. The immense popularity of Scott's novels throughout Europe and North America disseminated particular images of Templars that would influence popular understanding for generations, despite their limited connection to historical realities. The Romantic literary tradition established conventions for portraying Templars that emphasized their pride, wealth, and moral corruption during their final period, creating stock characters serving narrative functions in adventure stories set during the crusading era. The Victorian fascination with medievalism, expressed through Gothic revival architecture, pre-Raphaelite painting, and various forms of historical pageantry, created additional contexts for reimagining Templar history, according to 19th century cultural values and aesthetic preferences. The reconstruction of the Temple Church in London, following fire damage in 1841, involved architectural decisions, informed by contemporary understanding of medieval building practices, but also reflecting Victorian assumptions about appropriate restoration methods. The Victorian emphasis on moral earnestness, institutional order, and the civilizing mission of European culture influenced interpretations of the Templars as representatives of medieval Christendom's heroic attempts to spread civilization and true religion against barbarous opponents. The development of modern historical scholarship during the 19th century, characterized by systematic archival research, critical source evaluation, and attempts at objective reconstruction of past realities, produced more accurate understanding of Templar history, while simultaneously coexisting with continued popular fascination with romantic and esoteric interpretations. The professional historians who investigated Templar history using archival sources and critical methods generally concluded that the order had been a conventional medieval institution whose suppression resulted from political circumstances rather than genuine religious deviance. However, these scholarly findings reached limited audiences compared to the popular literature, secret society claims, and various forms of cultural production that continued elaborating mythological interpretations. The early 20th century expansion of archaeological investigation to include medieval sites created new categories of evidence for understanding Templar, material culture, and daily operations. The excavation of former Templar properties, using systematic archaeological methods, produced artifacts, architectural information, and environmental data that complemented and sometimes contradicted documentary sources. The development of archaeological techniques for investigating medieval rural and urban sites enabled recovery of information about diet, health, agricultural practices, and various aspects of daily life that documentary sources addressed only indirectly. The integration of archaeological evidence with traditional historical research created more comprehensive understanding, while also revealing the limitations and biases of different source types. The proliferation of conspiracy theories regarding Templar survival, hidden treasures, and secret knowledge during the 20th and 21st centuries reflects broader cultural patterns of distrust toward official narratives and fascination with supposed hidden histories, contradicting accepted scholarly understanding. The various theories claiming that Templars escaped suppression and continued operating clandestinely through subsequent centuries, that they possessed secret religious knowledge threatening Orthodox Christianity, or that they accumulated vast treasures subsequently hidden in various locations, have no credible evidentiary support and represent imaginative elaborations rather than serious historical hypotheses. The specific mechanisms proposed for these supposed conspiracies typically involve combinations of implausible scenarios, misinterpretation of ambiguous evidence, and selective citation of sources. While ignoring contradictory information, the claims regarding Templar fleet escape to Scotland or the Americas, Templar transformation into other organizations, or Templar preservation of heretical religious traditions, all fail upon examination of actual historical evidence and logical analysis of the scenarios proposed. The documentary record regarding the suppression's implementation, the tracking of individual Templars' fates, and the disposition of Templar properties provides no support for organized escape or institutional continuation. The absence of any credible contemporary evidence for these supposed survivals, combined with the demonstrable invention of supporting narratives during later periods, indicates that these theories serve cultural and commercial functions rather than representing genuine historical discoveries. The commercial exploitation of Templar mythology through popular literature, films, television programs, and video games has created global familiarity with distorted versions of Templar history that bear minimal resemblance to documented realities. The use of Templars as characters in adventure narratives, conspiracy thrillers, and various forms of entertainment prioritizes dramatic requirements over historical accuracy, creating stock representations, serving genre conventions rather than educational purposes. The economic incentives driving this commercial exploitation ensure continued production of Templar-themed content, regardless of scholarly objections about historical misrepresentation, as entertainment products target audiences seeking exciting narratives rather than accurate historical education. The internet age amplification of conspiracy theories and alternative histories has created unprecedented dissemination of false or misleading information about the Templars to global audiences. The democratic nature of internet publishing, combined with search algorithms that may prioritize engaging content over accurate information, enables conspiracy theories and romantic elaborations to reach audiences who may lack tools for evaluating source credibility or distinguishing documented history from imaginative speculation. The echo chamber effects of online communities devoted to particular theories create environments where contrary evidence is dismissed, and confirming interpretations are amplified, making correction of misinformation increasingly difficult. The responsible presentation of Templar history by professional historians, educators, and cultural institutions requires ongoing efforts to distinguish documented realities from mythological elaborations, while acknowledging the legitimate cultural significance of Templar memory in various non-scholarly contexts. The educational obligation to provide accurate information must be balanced against recognition that popular interest in the Templars often derives from their mythological dimensions rather than their historical realities. The effective communication of historical understanding to diverse audiences requires strategies addressing different levels of prior knowledge, varying interests, and the competition from commercially produced entertainment presenting distorted versions as factual history. The scholarly consensus regarding the Knights Templars' English history, based on systematic analysis of documentary sources and archaeological evidence, presents them as a significant medieval institution whose economic operations, political connections, and religious character made important contributions to English society during their nearly two-century presence. Their suppression resulted from political machinations rather than genuine religious deviance, while their historical legacy includes both the documented impacts of their activities and the mythological elaborations that transformed them into symbols serving various cultural needs across subsequent centuries. The distinction between these historical realities and later mythological appropriations represents essential scholarly responsibility, maintaining intellectual integrity, while recognizing that cultural memory operates according to different logic than historical reconstruction. The material remains of Templar presence in England, including architectural fragments, archaeological deposits, place names, and documentary records, provide tangible connections, enabling modern understanding of their actual operations, while creating ongoing responsibilities for preservation, interpretation, and public education. The Temple Church in London, the scattered archaeological sites throughout England, and the extensive archival materials documenting their activities collectively constitute heritage, requiring careful stewardship, ensuring both scholarly access and appropriate public engagement. The balance between preserving these resources for future research and making them accessible for contemporary educational purposes involves ongoing negotiations between preservation requirements, scholarly needs, and public interest. The Knights Templars' history in England, from their arrival in the late 1120s, through their suppression in 1312, and their subsequent transformation into cultural symbols, represents a complex narrative encompassing religious devotion, economic innovation, political integration, and ultimate destruction through circumstances beyond their control. Their documented activities reveal a sophisticated medieval institution adapting international organizational models to English conditions while contributing to agricultural development, commercial expansion, and governmental administration. Their mythological afterlife demonstrates the power of dramatic historical narratives to generate continuing cultural elaboration, regardless of historical accuracy, creating parallel traditions of scholarly investigation and popular imagination that address different audiences and serve different purposes. The responsibility of historians involves maintaining these distinctions while communicating effectively about both the documented realities and the cultural phenomena of mythological appropriation, ensuring that accurate understanding remains available, even as creative reimagining continues generating new variations on Templar themes for contemporary audiences.